Hi guys. Tonight we settle into a cabin buried in snowdrifts, the roof sagging under frozen weight, the wind keening across empty plains. You step inside and feel a blast of cold air, the kind that steals your breath before you can even close the rough-hewn door. Outside, the night presses in, and you realize without warmth, you probably won't survive this. Frontier families didn't just face discomfort, they lived with the constant awareness that a single bitter night could undo them. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And while you're at it, let me know your location and local time in the comments. Now, dim the lights. You crouch down in this one-room cabin, hearing the crunch of snow still clinging to your boots. The smell of resinous pine logs lingers where someone cut firewood earlier. Shadows stretch across rough timber walls. Families like this had no central heating, no radiators humming in the corner, just stone hearths, smoky chimneys, and the constant hope that embers would last until dawn. You press your palms together and exhale, imagining the sting of frost inside your chest, the ache of trying to breathe while icicles form on window panes. The mainstream fact is plain. Pioneers and settlers in North America regularly endured winter nights when temperatures dropped far below freezing. Yet their cabins, hastily built of logs or sod, rarely sealed tight. No insulation, no glass windows, just gaps that let in drafts sharp as knives. Quilts, blankets, and sheer stubbornness stood between them and frostbite. And still, historians still argue whether those families actually managed comfortable sleep at all, or whether nights were spent half awake, shivering, turning like rotisserie chickens to keep both sides from stiffening. You glance toward a corner where a straw mattress rests. No plush bedding here, just dried grasses laid on wooden boards, sometimes stuffed in a ticking sack. The faint rustle might hide mice, another unwelcome roommate. But against the unforgiving chill, even this scratchy bedding felt like a gift. Families layered blankets, feather quilts if they were lucky, sometimes even animal hides, piling everything heavy enough to pin sleepers down. Now, picture the quirky tidbit. Archaeologists have found accounts of settlers mixing cow dung with clay to plaster cabin walls. Not exactly glamorous interior design, but this crust sealed cracks and kept freezing wind at bay. You can almost smell it, earthy and acrid, a strange comfort when survival came first. As you shift your gaze to the hearth, a faint glow of embers pulses, casting red veins of light across the cabin floor. You imagine lying close, cheek pressed against the warmth radiating from the stones. But there's danger too. Sparks could leap onto bedding, and smoke often filled the room, stinging eyes, coating lungs. Winter nights carried not only cold but the constant gamble of fire. The frontier night is loud in its silence. Outside, wolves yip faintly in the distance, their calls riding the icy wind. Inside, children whisper lullabies, voices thin with sleep and shivers. The adults pull them closer, everyone pressed shoulder to shoulder. You hear the rasp of breath, the muffled cough, the creak of wooden joints under too many bodies on one frame. Imagine now stepping out briefly into the darkness. Your boots crunch hard, the snow almost glowing under moonlight. You tilt your head back, watching stars scatter like frozen sparks across the sky. The air slices into your lungs, and for a moment you feel the fragile miracle of simply being warm enough to stand here. Then, teeth chattering, you rush back in, slamming the door against the night. Frontier families carried this nightly rhythm, banking fires, piling bedding, huddling close. Parents listened for the telltale silence that meant embers had died, then dragged themselves from bed to stir the hearth, coaxing faint orange to life again. And still, morning often arrived with frozen water pails, frost tracing delicate lace over window shutters, and children reluctant to leave their fragile cocoons. So, as you lie back and let the cabin's shadows fold over you, you can almost feel what it was to sleep through the coldest nights without freezing to death. It wasn't luxury, It was endurance, invention, and togetherness stitched into every weary breath. You settle deeper into the story, letting your thoughts drift toward the earliest challenge frontier families faced, the very walls around them. Building a winter shelter wasn't just carpentry, it was the difference between living to see spring or slipping silently into the snow. Imagine yourself standing in a clearing, surrounded by towering pines, your breath hanging in the air like a ghost. You've got nothing but an axe, rough hands, and maybe a neighbor or two to help. How do you create a home that won't betray you when the blizzard comes rattling at the door? The mainstream historical fact is this: log cabins became the quintessential structure of frontier survival in early America. Settlers felled trees, trimmed branches, and dragged the heavy logs into place, stacking them in rough squares. The cracks between were stuffed with whatever material could be gathered: moss, clay, mud, even animal hair. This process, called chinking, was crude but crucial. Without it, icy drafts would whistle through the gaps, turning a cabin into a frozen wind tunnel. Now, here's a quirky tidbit. Some settlers swore by using rags soaked in bacon grease as a sealant pressed into the crevices between logs. It sounds bizarre, and maybe the neighborhood bears appreciated the smell, but the grease stiffened and hardened, creating a surprisingly durable plug against drafts. You can almost picture a child watching the grown-ups hammering fatty cloth strips into wooden walls, the scent of pork lingering faintly through the winter months. You can hear the sound of hammering echo in your imagination, the thud of axes splitting wood, the scrape of stone tools smoothing rough planks. When you run your hand along the wall, the bark is rough, uneven, but solid. Each log bears the marks of sweat and urgency. Historians still debate whether these cabins were truly efficient at keeping out the cold, or if they simply slowed the inevitable seep of freezing air. But one thing is certain: they provided psychological comfort. A family could sit inside and say, "We've built a roof between us and the storm." That hope alone was its own warmth. The roof often carried its own tale. Shingles cut by hand from cedar or oak were nailed down in overlapping layers. Some families, lacking nails or proper tools, weighted the shingles with stones or tied bundles with rawhide. If snow piled too heavy, the roof groaned under its burden and sometimes collapsed entirely. Imagine lying in bed, listening to the creaks above, praying that the sound stayed steady instead of snapping in the night. Inside, the floor was often nothing more than the bare earth. Some households tamped it down with heavy stones, smoothing it until it became hard as concrete. Others laid flat boards, if the family had the tools and time. You crouched down and touched that cold surface, realizing how quickly it must have sucked warmth from toes and blankets. Families spread straw or rushes, sometimes even layered dried leaves beneath rugs to make a buffer. Each addition was an act of defiance against the earth's chill. Think of the sheer time investment. It could take weeks to raise a cabin, even with help. And yet, the settlers knew they had no choice. Winter wasn't patient. You picture a family racing against the shortening days of autumn, children gathering moss for chinking, mothers stirring big pots of stew over outdoor fires, fathers hauling logs until shoulders ached. The pace wasn't optional. The cold would arrive whether they were ready or not. Now, let's pause for a moment of sensory imagination. You step outside, brushing sawdust from your coat, and the air is sharp enough to make your nostrils sting. All around you, the forest hums with silence, broken only by the crack of splitting wood. You can almost smell the pine sap, sticky and resinous, mixed with the earthy tang of freshly dug clay. There's no hum of traffic, no glow of streetlights, just you, the cabin, and the creeping certainty of winter pressing closer each day. One odd practice, whispered in some settlers' journals, tells of lining cabin interiors with newspapers when they could be spared. Not for reading, but for insulation. Whole pages of local gazettes were pasted against walls, creating a strange collage of headlines, sermon notes, and lost and found ads that doubled as a barrier against wind. It must have looked like a patchwork museum exhibit. By candlelight, Children sometimes traced the printed letters before bed, eyes heavy with sleep, as the news became both decoration and shield. Historians still argue whether early frontier families borrowed more techniques from indigenous neighbors than their own traditions admitted. Many native groups had centuries of knowledge about building snug shelters in freezing climates, from bark-covered wigwams to earth lodges. Some settlers learned and adopted ideas, like packing snow against the base of cabins to block drafts. Yet in letters and journals, these borrowings were often downplayed, as if acknowledging them undermined the settlers' pride in self-reliance. Still, the fingerprints of shared knowledge are visible if you look closely. At night, once walls stood firm and the roof sealed overhead, the family would gather by the fireplace. The cabin's corners might still sigh with cold air, but the logs now stood as sentinels against the storm. You listen as a child giggles under a quilt, while the father checks the chinking by candlelight, pressing more moss into any suspicious cracks. The mother sets down a basket of wool socks by the hearth, her hands red from washing them in icy water. Every detail feels humble, ordinary, yet stitched together into a tapestry of survival. Imagine what it felt like that first night in a brand new cabin. After weeks of work, after endless worry, the family finally lies on straw pallets, quilts tucked high. The walls creak but hold. The wind howls outside, but no longer slices directly across their faces. A faint fire glows, casting shadows like soft brushstrokes across log walls. For the first time, they can close their eyes without watching for snow piling directly on their blankets. That moment of relief must have tasted sweeter than any luxury. The quirky details don't end there. In some frontier diaries, you read about families who painted the insides of their cabins with milk and lime, partly for brightness, partly because they believed it discouraged insects and rot. The pale wash reflected candlelight, making rooms feel less gloomy, and perhaps, at least psychologically, warmer. You picture flickering light bouncing off whitewashed logs, transforming a cramped cabin into a small, glowing sanctuary against the dark wilderness outside. But even as you admire this ingenuity, you remember the fragility. Fire could undo all that effort in an instant. A single spark onto a straw mattress could send flames racing up the log walls, undoing months of work and leaving only ashes in the snow. Families slept with one ear tuned to the crackle of the hearth, grateful for its warmth yet wary of its danger. Survival on the frontier was always a gamble. Victory one night didn't guarantee the next. Still, as you imagine lying back on that rough mattress, the cabin's walls steady around you, there's a kind of peace in the thought. Yes, the logs are uneven, the air still sharp, the bedding thin, but you know without these walls you wouldn't last the night. The cabin isn't just wood and moss, it's hope nailed together by calloused hands, and that hope keeps you alive. You settle further into the story, the cabin now standing sturdily in your mind's eye, its walls braced against the winter storm. Beneath your boots, you feel the floor packed from earth, hard and unyielding, but softened by the creative touches of those who called this place home. Sleeping arrangements on bare soil may sound miserable to you today, but on the frontier, people adapted with quiet determination. They discovered that even the humblest of coverings, straw, rushes, or worn textiles, could make the difference between misery and tolerable rest. One well-documented reality of those households is that earthen floors dominated frontier interiors, especially in the first years after settlement. Cutting planks required sawmills, and sawmills required time, tools, and a community with resources. Families in isolated regions simply couldn't manage it. So, they tamped down soil, watered it, and beat it firm until it became nearly as smooth as stone. It wasn't elegant, but it was functional, and it absorbed the daily pounding of boots, livestock hooves, and children's bare feet. At night, when temperatures plummeted, this earth floor radiated cold like a vast stone slab, seeping through bedding unless countered by clever insulation. One unusual practice worth noting: families sometimes spread fresh straw across the dirt floor not just for cushioning but for its insulating quality. Every week or two, the straw was replaced, becoming a cycle of fresh scents mingling with smoke and cooking. Imagine the faint rustle underfoot as children tiptoe across the room, straw crunching softly in the dim candlelight. Over time, this bedding wasn't just comfort, it became a kind of hygiene measure too, soaking up spills and ash. Of course, mice and insects found it delightful as well, darting beneath the layers like unwanted roommates. Researchers remain divided on the question of how clean these makeshift floors actually remained. Some diaries describe weekly rituals of sweeping out the straw and replacing it with bundles tied from nearby fields. Others hint at longer stretches of neglect, when the floor grew damp, dusty, or even alive with tiny scuttling shapes. Which version was more typical? The truth probably varied from cabin to cabin, shaped by the energy and health of each family. Now picture the sleeping surface itself, sacks stuffed with straw or corn husks laid out on the ground. If you press your hand into such bedding, you'd feel the crunch, the uneven give, the bits poking through the cloth. Over time, the husks broke down into dust, and the sacks needed refilling. It wasn't exactly a luxury mattress, but to settlers, it was better than lying straight on frozen soil. Those who were lucky enough to own sheep sometimes mixed in wool. Those near marshes harvested reeds. Families innovated with whatever the landscape offered. The sensory details of such an arrangement were vivid. Imagine drifting off to sleep with the scent of dry grass lingering in your nose, the sound of straw shifting as your family shifted beside you. In the dark, you'd hear the faint squeak of mice nosing around, or the hiss of wind pressing against the chinked walls. Every movement in the night reminded you of your closeness to the raw earth. Curiously, some settlers even rubbed oil or animal fat into the packed floor, a trick borrowed from older European peasant homes. This created a smoother, somewhat shinier surface that resisted dust. Children sometimes skated toy pebbles across it, pretending it was ice. The faint gleam by candlelight made the one-room dwelling feel a fraction more finished, almost civilized amid the wilderness. Meanwhile, the bedding arrangements grew inventive. Families often slept in layers, first a sack of straw on the floor, then a quilt, then everyone piled together under heavy blankets. If the house had a bed frame, it was usually reserved for the parents, while children lay on pallets of straw nearby. The closeness wasn't just emotional, it was thermal engineering. More bodies meant more heat, and more heat meant a better chance of waking up alive. Debates still swirl around whether this arrangement was truly effective. Did huddling together on straw over an earthen floor save lives in the long term? Some historians suggest that yes, body heat and layers kept most families safe. Others argue that illness and dampness from the ground may have offset the benefits. Frontier memoirs reflect both stories. Some recall nights of snug security, others of coughing children and aching bones from the chill. And yet, these homes didn't stand still in their ingenuity. As soon as nails or saws were available, many households improved their floors. Split logs were laid flat, sometimes called puncheon floors, rough but raised above the earth. Families without tools used packed clay, smoothed with water and ashes. Over time, they upgraded again, adding planks, then rugs, then feather beds if fortune smiled. The progression tells a story of gradual comfort, step by step away from raw survival. Still, there was a kind of intimacy in those early years. You, lying beside your family on straw pallets, feel the warmth of someone's shoulder, hear the slow breathing of children, and notice the crackle of straw under shifting bodies. You close your eyes, smelling earth, wood smoke, and faintly sour wool. Outside, snow covers the ground, but inside, the layered bedding and straw buffer you just enough. Sleep comes not because you are comfortable, but because exhaustion insists, and because you trust the fragile rituals that families refined through generations. It's worth pausing to imagine the morning after. When dawn crept in through shutter cracks, frost often outlined the bedding where breath condensed and froze. Straw scattered the floor as children clambered out, rubbing their eyes, leaving little trails across the dirt. Parents shook out the bedding, checked for damp patches, and sometimes dragged sacks outside to air in the weak Sunday. The daily rhythm of cleaning, refilling, and spreading straw became as much a survival tactic as cutting wood or baking bread. Over time, these rituals left a mark not just on the floors but on memory. Later generations recalled the sound of straw rustling at night as a kind of lullaby. One pioneer woman wrote that she missed the earthy smell when her family finally upgraded to wood planks. It reminded her of those raw, formative years when every night felt like a test of endurance. There is something strangely tender in that, the recognition that even hardship carries its own nostalgia once it's safely behind you. So, as you drift further into the story, picture yourself lying down again on that layered straw bed, the floor beneath you hard but softened by ingenuity, the cabin groaning gently around you. You're not comfortable, but you're alive, and that simple fact is the victory. Tomorrow, you'll replace the straw, smooth the floor, and prepare for another night. Tonight, though, you let the earthy smell and faint crackle carry you toward dreams. The cabin walls now stand firm in your imagination, the earthen floor layered with straw and husks. But in the heart of every frontier night, there was one element that ruled above all others: the fire. You picture it glowing faintly in the hearth, its light painting long orange streaks across rough-hewn logs, its warmth reaching across the room like an invisible blanket. Without fire, the night was not just unpleasant, it was unlivable. It is widely acknowledged among historians that the fireplace was the center of frontier life, not merely for cooking, but as the primary defense against death by cold. A fire was carefully banked each evening so that its embers would last until dawn, covered in ashes to smolder slowly. If it went out in the middle of the night, someone had to stumble from bed, coax a spark back to life, and hope the wood was dry enough to catch. Families who failed to keep the fire alive might wake to a room where their water pails had frozen solid, where frost coated the walls like lace, and where breath crystallized in mid-air. One curious detail tucked into old letters tells of children assigned to fire watch duty, their small bodies wrapped in quilts, sitting near the hearth to ensure the glow never faded too low. Imagine the drooping eyes of a child swaying in half-sleep, poking at embers with a stick while outside the wind screamed against the shutters. In households without older children, parents took turns, dozing in shifts so the hearth would not betray them. Experts disagree about the precise methods families used to maximize warmth from such modest fires. Some accounts describe stacking rocks in the hearth, allowing them to absorb heat, then moving them near bedsides. Others insist that carefully chosen wood, hickory or oak burned longer and hotter, reducing the risk of a midnight freeze. Either way, the fire became not just a source of heat but a carefully managed tool, requiring daily knowledge and care. Now, take a sensory step closer. You hear the steady crackle, feel the pulse of heat on your cheeks while your back still aches from the chill of the cabin. The smell of smoke clings to your hair and clothes, a perfume you never quite escape. Sparks jump occasionally, a small warning that bedding drawn too close could mean disaster. You can almost hear the coughing of children inhaling smoky air, their lungs raw yet their bodies warmer than they would have been otherwise. Some families grew inventive with their hearths. One unusual practice was to rake ashes into a mound at the back of the fireplace, then bury glowing coals beneath. This created a slow-burning heat source that could be revived in the morning. Others learned to position a flat iron or brick on the hearth, heating it, then wrapping it in cloth and slipping it between quilts. These glowing stones carried warmth into the deepest hours of night, radiating comfort where firelight could not reach. There is ongoing debate among researchers about whether chimneys of early cabins helped or hindered survival. Poorly built stone chimneys leaked heat as quickly as they funneled smoke away, and some collapsed under snow or wind. Others argue that without chimneys, smoke buildup would have suffocated families long before frostbite could. Perhaps the truth lies somewhere in between. Survival meant balancing risk. Smoke stung eyes, and coughing throats against the chill that could stop a heart. Imagine for a moment the sounds surrounding you in such a night. The fire pops, wood shifts, a log sighs into flame. Beyond that silence. Outside, snow muffles the landscape, muting the cries of owls and coyotes. Inside, every sound is magnified. The scrape of a poker against stone, the whisper of quilts shifting, the slow, steady breathing of sleepers clumped together. The hearth is not just heat but company, a living heartbeat in the middle of the room. One little-known custom among settlers was arranging sleeping spots in a circle around the fireplace, like spokes radiating from a wheel. Children closest, adults behind, older grandparents furthest away where drafts crept in. The logic was simple. Bodies that needed heat most were guarded by those with greater resilience. This image of rings of humanity, heads toward the flames and feet toward the cold walls, is haunting and strangely beautiful. At times, desperation led to risky experiments. Diaries mention attempts to burn green wood, which hissed and smoked but refused to yield much heat. Others describe gathering dried dung from cattle or buffalo, burning it slowly like coal. The smell was acrid, filling the cabin with a bitterness that clung to clothes and hair. Yet, when temperatures plunged, people burned what they had, preferring stench to silence. Morning often told the tale of how well the fire had served. If embers still glowed under ash, the day began with gratitude. If the hearth lay cold and dead, the family scrambled for flint and steel, striking sparks onto charred cloth or tinder. Failure meant trudging through snow to a neighbor's cabin, begging for a glowing coal to carry home in a covered pan. You can almost feel the humiliation-grown men pleading for a scrap of someone else's fire, their pride bent under the weight of survival. Yet there was comfort too. The fire became a kind of companion, its rhythms woven into family memory. Children grew up associating its flicker with safety, the glow marking the boundary between life and peril. One settler's memoir described falling asleep to the sound of wood snapping in the hearth as the lullaby of the wilderness. Another remembered the glow on his parents' faces, their expressions soft as the firelight painted them with amber hues. Even so, fires carried their own terror. Whole cabins were lost to flames that leapt too far in the night. Families sometimes woke to smoke and sparks, dragging children out into snowdrifts with nothing but the clothes on their backs. Such stories circulated as warnings, reinforcing the delicate balance frontier people lived with. Heat was life, but too much heat, uncontrolled, was destruction. Tonight, as you close your eyes within this imagined cabin, you feel the fire's pulse. The glow washes your cheeks, your toes stretch toward the warmth, and the shadows flicker across the low ceiling. You know the embers may fade, and you may wake shivering before dawn, but for now, the fire holds. It cradles you like a fragile guardian, burning down slowly, steadily, just enough to carry you through the long winter night. You've imagined the glow of the hearth, its sparks flickering into the shadows, but warmth in a frontier home rarely came from fire alone. More often, survival depended on the closeness of human bodies, the pooling of breath, the shared cocoon of quilts, the steady heat radiating from skin. It wasn't only affection that drew families together at night, it was necessity. Surviving letters and journals make it clear that many households shared a single bed, or at least a single sleeping space. Parents, children, and sometimes visiting relatives or boarders crowded under one heavy pile of blankets. It was practical. The more bodies in contact, the less each individual had to fight against the cold. You imagine lying in a crowded bed, your shoulder pressed against a sibling's, the edge of a quilt tugged this way and that by restless feet. Comfort wasn't a priority, survival was. An offbeat detail that emerges in frontier accounts is that families often slept head to toe, arranging themselves alternately so that one person's feet pressed against the next person's head. It sounds awkward, but this odd choreography minimized space and maximized warmth, turning a bed into a puzzle of limbs and quilts. Children especially remembered this pattern with a mix of humor and resentment, who wouldn't complain about waking to a brother's icy toes against their cheek. Modern scholarship continues to wrestle with how culturally acceptable such closeness really felt. Some argue that in communities used to large, extended families and shared labor, there was little embarrassment about huddling together at night. Others suggest that as soon as households had the resources, they rushed to separate sleeping quarters, craving privacy as much as comfort. The truth, perhaps, is that necessity outweighed preference, and cultural norms bent under the pressure of freezing winters. Let your senses fill the scene. The air inside the bed canopy is warmer, filled with the mingled smell of wool, straw, and breath. Quilts weigh heavily on your chest, pressing you into the mattress. You hear the sound of slow breathing, the cough of someone fighting a cold, the occasional creak of the bed frame. Outside, wind claws at the shutters, but inside, the nest of bodies feels like a single organism, every heartbeat contributing to the fragile warmth. Curiously, some households included not just family but hired hands or neighbors in this shared sleep. A traveler might be invited to squeeze into a bed if storms made the journey home impossible. Hospitality in such times wasn't just kindness, it was the only way to ensure everyone made it through the night. Imagine the awkward politeness of strangers sliding under the same quilt, the first minutes filled with stiff silence before fatigue and cold erased boundaries. Folklore and memory preserve stories of children whispering to each other in the dark, inventing games to distract from the numbness creeping into their toes. They told riddles, sang snatches of songs, or listened to tales whispered by parents about warmer lands. These nighttime rituals became part of the fabric of survival, shared warmth wrapped not only in quilts but also in words. There's still disagreement among researchers about just how common multifamily sleeping really was. Some diaries mention it constantly, while others insist on separate pallets or lofts. Geography played a role. In harsher northern climates, communal beds were more likely, while in milder regions, families sometimes risked the luxury of space. The debate underscores how flexible survival strategies could be, bending to the demands of weather, resources, and culture. Now, picture the quilt itself. Heavy, patchworked, stitched from scraps of old dresses, coats, or flour sacks. Feathers, if available, puffed its interior, but more often it was simply layer upon layer of fabric, sewn tight. You run your fingers over uneven stitches, each one a mark of care. These blankets weren't bought in stores, they were survival tools made by hands that knew cold all too well. One unusual practice, recalled in Scandinavian immigrant families, was to hang fur pelts over quilts, creating a final shield against icy air. Deer hides, bear skins, or even sheep fleeces turned into makeshift duvets. The smell of animal lingered in the fibers, mingling with smoke and sweat, but the warmth was undeniable. Children sometimes fought over who got the good fur, the one that smelled less pungent or felt softer to the touch. The intimacy of these arrangements carried psychological weight. In the darkest nights, pressed so closely together, families found reassurance. Even when the wind howled outside, even when snow drifted high against the door, they had each other's heat. That bond, forged by survival, shaped memories of childhood for decades to come. Some memoirs recall those nights with nostalgia. I never felt so safe as when all of us lay together beneath the quilts. Others remembered it with relief when independence finally came. I vowed that once I had my own house, I'd never sleep another night with someone's elbow in my ribs. Imagine the morning scene. The fire is little more than ash, and the quilt is damp from condensed breath. You stretch stiff limbs, trying to peel away from the knot of bodies without waking everyone. The air outside the quilt hits like a slap, cold and merciless. Quickly, you scramble to pull on socks and wool caps, your breath clouding in the dim room. And yet, beneath the discomfort, there's gratitude. You are alive, and so is everyone you shared the bed with. Perhaps the most striking thought is how these arrangements blurred the line between affection and strategy. You weren't cuddling because you felt romantic. You were layering warmth like living blankets. You weren't telling stories to pass time, you were distracting children from the bite of the cold. Each touch, each whispered word, each sigh under heavy quilts was a calculated act of endurance, stitched seamlessly into family life. As you sink into this image, let yourself feel the press of those quilts, the weight of shared breath, and the small miracle of body heat keeping frost at bay. It isn't glamorous, it isn't private, but it is survival. And in the stillness of the night, it is enough. You linger in that crowded bed for a moment longer, quilts piled high, bodies pressed close, until you notice the stitching and the fabric itself. Those layers weren't simply bought, they were earned, stitched, patched, and repurposed from every scrap a household could muster. On the frontier, bedding became both art and armor, holding together families against the long assault of winter. Surviving records from household inventories confirm just how prized featherbeds, wool blankets, and quilts were. A feather mattress, filled with goose or duck down, could keep sleepers warm even when ice spread across the inside of windows. Quilts, sewn from worn-out clothing, told the history of the family through fabric. A piece of a child's first dress might sit beside a square from a father's discarded work shirt. When stitched together, the quilt became a living chronicle as well as a shield. One little-known custom among some rural households was the trundle quilt, deliberately made oversized so it could spill across the floor, sealing the gap where icy drafts crept under the bed. Picture it now. The heavy edge of a quilt dragging across dirt or straw flooring, acting almost like weather stripping. It may have looked ragged, but it trapped warmth where it was most desperately needed. Researchers still debate how much access poorer families had to feathers or wool. Diaries from wealthier households describe feather ticks thick, luxurious mattresses filled with down that insulated bodies against the cold ground. Yet many others relied only on husks, straw, or patchwork covers without insulation. Some scholars argue that the feather bed became a symbol of status on the frontier, a mark that a family had secured enough flocks or trade to afford such comfort. Let your senses explore the bedding more closely. Run your hands over a quilt's uneven stitches, the fabric softened by years of use. The smell is a blend of smoke from the fire, soap from the occasional wash, and the faint mustiness of damp cloth that never quite dries in winter. When you slide under it, the weight presses you down comfortingly, cocooning you against the drafts that prowl the corners of the room. Curiously, in certain immigrant traditions, quilts carried spiritual meaning as well as physical warmth. Scandinavian families sometimes embroidered protective symbols into the corners, believing the stitching warded off misfortune during the long nights. German settlers spoke of spirit threads, bits of red yarn woven through quilts to guard children from illness. These details remind you that bedding wasn't only a practical tool, it was woven with memory, belief, and a kind of quiet magic. Imagine lying beneath such a quilt while snow rattles against the shutters. The fabric feels heavy, almost immovable, pinning you into a safe cocoon. Children wriggle beneath it like restless kittens, feet kicking, bodies twisting, while parents murmur for stillness. The closeness makes every sound louder. A sigh, a cough, the whisper of fabric shifting. And yet, the quilt muffles the worst of the cold, turning a fragile log cabin into a semblance of home. Experts disagree about just how often families manage to keep bedding dry. Some argue that in tightly sealed cabins, smoke and condensation made quilts perpetually damp, their insulation weakened by moisture. Others insist that careful drying near the hearth restored warmth each day. Perhaps both are true. Some nights quilts clung to sleepers with clammy heaviness, while other nights they crackled with dry warmth straight from the fire. There's something poignant about the image of children snuggling beneath a quilt, stitched from scraps of their parents' clothing. One memoir recalls a daughter recognizing her mother's faded dress sleeve sewn into a patch near her face. "I kissed it good night, for I knew no one else had ever worn it but her." That intimacy, of fabric carrying memory, blurred the line between comfort and survival. Oddly enough, some households used bedding for barter. A quilt could be traded for food or tools. though such exchanges left a family more vulnerable. Imagine the pain of giving up the very quilt that kept your children warm, hoping in return to feed them through the next week. Each piece of bedding carried enormous value, both practical and emotional. In sensory terms, the bedding often smelled strongly of whatever household chore it had last endured. Quilts reeked faintly of wood smoke, wool blankets of lanolin, featherbeds of musty down. Over time, these scents became inseparable from the experience of winter nights. To the modern nose, it might seem pungent or unpleasant. To those families, it was simply the fragrance of survival. Even the act of making bedding shaped community life. Quilting bees, gatherings where women stitched together patchwork, became moments of social bonding, swapping stories and songs while their hands worked. The finished quilt represented not just protection, but also the collective labor of friends and neighbors. In this way, warmth was literally stitched by many hands, a communal effort against the loneliness of winter. Picture the rhythm of such a gathering, the scrape of needles pulling thread, the laughter echoing in a chilly room, steam rising from mugs of cider. Children ran underfoot while adults bent over fabric, creating patterns that would soon lie across beds in snowbound cabins. The quilt that resulted carried those voices within its stitches, every square a reminder that no family faced the frontier entirely alone. Of course, not every bed cover was handmade artistry. Many were simple, coarse, and purely functional. Old grain sacks stitched together, layered blankets patched so many times they became more patch than fabric. Yet even those humble coverings meant the difference between frostbitten nights and mornings with enough strength to milk the cow or cut firewood. Now, as you return to that imagined bed, you feel the quilt draped heavily across you. It carries stories, scents, even symbols stitched into its corners. You sense how much labor and memory went into its creation, how many hands touched it, how many nights it has endured. It is not luxurious, but in the frozen darkness, it is life itself. And as you drift deeper, the quilt's weight presses away the cold, letting your mind slide softly toward dreams. The quilt presses down on you, holding in the warmth, but your attention drifts toward the edges of the cabin, the places where cold always found a way in. Even the thickest quilts or warmest bodies could be defeated by a stubborn draft, slipping through cracks in walls or windows. To frontier families, fighting drafts was like waging a nightly battle against an invisible intruder. Contemporary accounts consistently note how windows and doors became the weak points in winter shelters. Glass panes were rare luxuries on the frontier. Most households settled for oiled paper stretched across wooden frames, or at best, shutters nailed from rough planks. These coverings dimly admitted daylight, but did little to hold back the midnight air. You picture a sheet of paper stiffened with grease, glowing faintly when the moonlight strikes it, but flapping in the wind when storms roll through. One unusual trick that settlers used involved stuffing rags, moss, or even old corn cobs into gaps around shutters. The logic was simple. Anything that blocked air was better than nothing. Children often helped in this nightly ritual, jamming bits of cloth into holes while their parents inspected the seams. It wasn't pretty, but each scrap meant fewer icy fingers creeping into the room. There's still disagreement among historians about how effective these makeshift barriers really were. Some evidence suggests that shutting a cabin tight invited condensation and frost to build inside, dampening bedding and making sleepers even colder. Others argue that without such efforts, the sheer force of wind would have swept through cabins, leaving families no chance at rest. Survival, as usual, lay in compromise. Tighten the cabin too much, and you risk dampness. Leave it loose, and you risk frostbite. Let yourself feel this sensory detail. A cold draft brushing across your cheek as you lie under quilts, so faint you might think it's a dream. You shift closer to the wall for protection, only to discover that the log beside you is cold as stone, sending its own chill into your skin. Every creak of the shutters reminds you how fragile the barrier is between inside and out. A little-known custom, especially among Appalachian families, was to hang heavy rugs or blankets over doors at night. turning them into makeshift curtains. By day, these coverings could be lifted aside, but at night they dropped like theatre curtains, trapping precious warmth inside. The smell of damp wool clung to them, heavy and comforting, and children sometimes played hide and seek behind them in the dim candlelight. You can almost hear the sounds of the room settling into its defences. A father wedges a wooden bar across the door, muttering as he checks the latch. A mother hangs another quilt across the window frame. Children scamper to stuff rags into cracks, laughing when the cold air nips at their fingers. Slowly, the cabin transforms into a fortress, not against wolves or raiders, but against the relentless breath of winter itself. Scholars continue to discuss whether settlers borrowed these window-sealing practices from European peasant traditions or developed them independently under American conditions. In Germany and Scandinavia, peasants had long used shutters and cloth coverings against drafts, while English cottages often relied on layered curtains. The blending of immigrant habits with frontier improvisation makes it difficult to trace the exact origins, but the result was unmistakably practical. Anything that plugged a hole kept a family alive. In sensory terms, the sealed windows carried their own atmosphere. Oiled paper, when lit from within, cast a soft amber glow, blurring faces into silhouettes. Wool rugs over doors muffled outside noise, wrapping the cabin in a strange, insulated silence. The air became thick with breath and smoke, less fresh but safer. Imagine lying in such a room, the world reduced to flickering shadows, your ears filled only with the sound of fire crackling and the steady breathing of loved ones. Occasionally, ingenuity went further. Families placed barrels of water against drafty walls, believing the thermal mass would absorb cold air before it reached the bed. Others stacked firewood along walls to block cracks, turning supplies into insulation. These odd strategies transformed ordinary objects into tools of survival. And yet, the cold always found its way back in. Diaries describe waking to snow that had drifted through keyholes or sifted between logs, dusting blankets like powdered sugar. Imagine brushing frost from your hair, shaking snow from your quilt, and realizing it had fallen inside your own home. The cabin might be sealed as best it could, but winter never stopped testing its defenses. Children grew up remembering the rituals of sealing windows as part of bedtime itself. One memoir recalled the draft hunt, when siblings competed to find the coldest crack and plug it fastest. Another described the joy of standing close to a shutter after it was patched, proud that the icy sting had vanished. These games masked the seriousness of the task, teaching the next generation to turn hardship into habit. The debates among modern historians continue. Were frontier homes truly livable through the coldest months, or did families endure nights of near-constant shivering, despite all precautions? Some argue that only the healthiest survived, while others highlight the adaptability of human bodies to extreme conditions. What seems certain is that sealing windows and doors wasn't optional. It was the nightly ceremony that stood between survival and collapse. As you settle back in this imagined cabin, you feel the difference once the shutters are barred, the cracks stuffed, the quilt hung over the door. The room grows quieter, stiller, less hostile. The wind outside still howls, but it no longer bites your skin. You draw the quilt closer, sink deeper into the straw mattress, and drift towards sleep, knowing that the fortress may not be perfect, but for tonight, it is enough. The shutters are sealed now, rugs and quilts hanging thick across the cracks. But there's another form of warmth stirring in the cabin, a warmth that breathes, shifts, and occasionally snores. Families didn't always rely only on each other's bodies. They sometimes welcomed their animals into the nighttime circle. Dogs, cats, and on the harshest nights, even livestock stepped across the threshold, their presence reshaping the way frontier people endured winter. It is well recorded in farm journals and pioneer memoirs that household dogs were not simply guardians of the yard, but also living blankets. They curled at the feet of children, their fur radiating heat through thin quilts. Cats crept onto straw pallets, seeking warmth as much as they gave it, purring like small furnaces in the dark. The companionship was practical. Fewer rodents, fewer drafts felt across toes, and a sense of protection as sharp ears caught sounds the family might miss. An offbeat recollection preserved in a New England diary tells of a family who deliberately coaxed their cow into the cabin on the coldest nights. The animal standing near the door while children slept within arm's reach. The smell must have been powerful, the space cramped beyond belief, yet the heat from a full-bodied creature outweighed the inconvenience. "We shared the winter with our Bessie," the farmer's daughter wrote, "and never were the warmer for it." Researchers remain divided about just how common such practices were. Some argue that bringing animals inside posed too many health hazards, disease, parasites, filth. Others contend that in the direst circumstances, practicality trumped hygiene, and families did what they had to do. The absence of widespread documentation may say less about rarity than about embarrassment. After all, who wanted to admit they had slept nose to tail with their pig just to avoid frostbite? Now close your eyes and imagine the sensory detail. You're lying beneath a heavy quilt, and at your feet a dog shifts, sighing into the straw. Its fur smells of smoke and earth, its body heat seeping through the covers into your toes. Somewhere nearby, a cat needs a blanket, its purr vibrating against the silence. And in the far corner, a goat rustles in its pen, breathing softly, the faint odor of hay mixing with wood smoke. The sounds and scents aren't refined, but they make the room feel alive, a chorus of beings resisting the winter together. One curious practice noted in Scandinavian immigrant families was the building of animal corners inside the cabin, small enclosed stalls where sheep or goats could spend the night. The warmth from these animals raised the temperature enough to ease the family's sleep. Children often delighted in reaching through the slats to stroke the wool before drifting off. That sense of sharing space blurred the line between human home and barn, but on the frontier, such lines were already blurred. Experts disagree about whether these arrangements truly saved lives or simply made nights more tolerable. Some point to accounts of cabins kept significantly warmer by shared animal heat. Others caution that smoke-filled rooms combined with animal odors may have worsened respiratory illness, offsetting the benefit. Perhaps both were true. Depending on circumstance, warmth gained in one breath, lungs irritated in the next. But consider the psychological warmth as well. A dog nestled against your legs reminded you that you weren't alone in the dark. A cow in the corner represented food and milk, even in the heart of winter. To hear a steady breath that wasn't human must have felt like another guardian spirit watching the night. In a landscape where cold seemed determined to kill, every living heartbeat was a reassurance. Quaint anecdotes capture the intimacy of these moments. One pioneer boy recalled that when he woke shivering in the night, he pressed himself between the family dog and his little sister, and never slept sounder. Another wrote of kittens curled beneath quilts, mistaken for hot stones until they squirmed. These memories, preserved in adulthood, became part of the affectionate folklore of survival. The debates among scholars continue. Were frontier families exceptionally tolerant of such arrangements, or did necessity leave them no choice? Some argue that early settlers carried with them European habits of close proximity between humans and animals, especially in poorer rural communities where barns and homes were sometimes under one roof. Others suggest that American frontiersmen resisted this unless desperate. In truth, every household probably drew its own line, adjusting it whenever the temperature plunged. Think of the dawn that followed such a night. The dog stretches, shaking straw across the floor. The cat leaps lightly toward the door, waiting for it to open. Perhaps the cow lowed impatiently, steaming breath filling the room as the family hurried to move it back to the barn. The air is heavy with smells, but also with relief. The household made it through another night. Even today, echoes of this practice linger in the phrase, "three-dog night," borrowed from cultures where the coldest evenings were judged by how many dogs one needed to keep warm. On the frontier, that wasn't just an expression, it was literal. Your survival might depend on how many creatures you could gather into one fragile circle of warmth. So tonight, as you slip deeper into this story, imagine the press of fur against your legs, the purr in your ears, the soft shuffle of hooves in the corner. You are no longer just a family of humans bracing against the storm. You are a small community of beings, each sharing what warmth they have, and together you endure. The warmth of animals lingers in your imagination, their steady breath joining the chorus of sleepers. But frontier families had another clever tool in their nightly defense: fabric barriers that transformed a bed into a private fortress. Curtains, canopies, and hangings weren't just decorations. They were ingenious shields, capturing what little heat the body produced and sealing it close through the long, bitter hours. Travelers' accounts from the 18th and 19th centuries often describe entering a frontier cabin and noticing beds tucked against walls, half hidden by sheets of cloth or old blankets hung from ceiling beams. It wasn't fashion, it was physics. A hanging canopy could trap a bubble of warm air around the sleepers, reducing the constant assault of drafts. You can picture it now, a square of faded fabric drooping from wooden rods, fluttering slightly with each breath, cocooning the family against the icy gloom. An odd but memorable detail survives from New England farmsteads, where some families stretched patchwork quilts on hoops above the bed, lowering them at night like tents. Children especially adored this arrangement, calling it their playhouse, though it was less about play than about keeping noses from freezing. In the morning, when quilts were lifted, warm air spilled out in a rush, leaving everyone reluctant to leave their little cave. There is still disagreement among scholars about how widely bed curtains were used in poorer households. Wealthier families could afford proper canopied frames, complete with heavy drapes woven for the purpose. But settlers improvising with flour sacks, patched sheets, or even animal hides left fewer records. Some historians argue these makeshift hangings were common. Others believe they were luxuries of better, supplied communities. The debate continues, tugging at the fabric of memory, much as families once tugged cloth into place each night. Step closer into this scene. Imagine lying back while a curtain is drawn across your bed, shutting out the dim flicker of the fire. Instantly, the space feels warmer, quieter, more intimate. Your breath fills the small enclosure, thickening the air, frosting lightly against the fabric walls. You hear the muffled world outside, the creak of rafters, the shuffle of feet, but inside, you are wrapped in your own capsule of safety. One curious practice, recorded in immigrant communities from Scotland, was to hang bed curtains embroidered with protective symbols, stars, knots, or crosses meant to ward off evil spirits that prowled the night. Whether these charms offered spiritual or psychological warmth hardly mattered. Children drifted to sleep, tracing the shapes stitched into the cloth, feeling both physically and spiritually defended. Experts remain divided on whether these enclosures posed risks as well as benefits. Some argue that thick curtains, combined with smoky cabins, reduced ventilation to dangerous levels. Others point out that most households lived with so many cracks and gaps that suffocation was hardly a concern. The truth, as always, likely depended on circumstance. What saved one family from frostbite may have left another coughing through the night. Now focus on the sensory layers of such a setup. The fabric smells faintly of soap, or perhaps damp wool. It brushes your cheek as you shift, whispering softly with every movement. Light filters through unevenly, creating patches of shadow like ghostly patterns across your quilt. You can feel the difference in temperature, warmer within, sharper and biting just beyond the curtain's edge. That small partition is the border between discomfort and survival. Memories preserved in diaries reveal the emotional comfort these hangings gave. One woman recalled feeling as if we slept in a separate world, the curtain transforming the crowded one-room cabin into a private chamber. For children, the illusion of a secret hideout added a sense of wonder to otherwise harsh conditions. The curtain became not just insulation but imagination, a place where stories whispered in the dark seemed larger than life. Strangely enough, some families even used their canopy frames to dry clothes, hanging damp socks or mittens above the bed, so the trapped warmth might hasten the drying. Waking beneath a curtain lined with steaming garments may not sound pleasant, but when snow soaked every outing, it was practical. You can almost smell the wet wool, pungent and sour, mingling with smoke and breath. The academic debate also touches on the origins of such hangings. Were they purely European imports, echoes of medieval four-poster beds, or natural inventions of people facing drafts with scraps of fabric? Some scholars argue that cultural memory carried the idea across the Atlantic, while others suggest necessity reinvented the practice wherever winters demanded. In either case, the fabric shielded countless sleepers from the cruelest touch of night air. Morning brought its own rituals. Curtains were drawn aside, their folds stiff with frost at the edges. Children emerged yawning, hair static with the trapped air, while parents folded fabric carefully to protect it from sparks or damp. The bubble dissolved, and the family returned to the shared reality of the cold cabin. But for those hours of darkness, the curtain had created a fragile paradise, thin cloth between them and the wilderness. Even now, echoes linger in modern comfort. The heavy duvets and enclosed sleeping bags we take, camping echo the same principle. Trap the heat, hold it close, survive the night. The ingenuity of those frontier bed curtains whispers through time, reminding us that even the simplest fabric, hung with care, could mean the difference between life and death. So, as you sink deeper into the imagined room, feel the curtain brushing softly against your skin, hear the muffled quiet within its folds, and let the sense of enclosure reassure you. Outside, the wind rattles against the shutters. Inside, your little tent of fabric holds warmth like a secret, keeping you safe until dawn. The canopy sways faintly in your mind's eye, fabric whispering with every breath. But beneath those quilts, inside that fragile fortress of cloth, another weapon against the cold was always present: the clothes you wore to bed. Today, many imagine sleepwear as a luxury soft pajamas. Thin cotton, but on the frontier, sleep clothing was armor, layered deliberately, each piece chosen to keep death at bay. It is widely acknowledged from household records and letters that frontier families rarely stripped down at night in the way modern sleepers do. Instead, they climbed under quilts fully dressed, often in the very garments worn all day. Wool shirts, thick stockings, long undergarments, and knitted caps were part of the nightly ritual. Nightgowns existed, but only if a family had fabric to spare. For most, practicality came first. What you wore during the day, you likely wore to bed, adding layers as needed. A curious but revealing tidbit comes from journals describing nightcaps, those woolen or linen hats that kept heads from losing heat. Children wore them with flaps tied beneath the chin, giving them an almost comical look in the dark. Without them, ears and noses quickly froze. Even adults kept caps snug, pulling them low until only eyes peered out above the quilt. In paintings of the period, such caps often look quaint, but in reality, they were life-saving tools. Scholars continue to disagree about just how many layers families piled on at night. Some argue that too much clothing risked dampness from sweat, which could chill the body once it cooled. Others insist that layering every scrap of wool or linen available was essential. Letters and oral histories hint at both experiences. Some families swore by heavy layering, while others learned to balance warmth with ventilation, discovering the line between comfort and clammy misery. Now, let yourself feel it. You climb beneath quilts, already weighted with history. But tonight you're wrapped in layers. Wool stockings scratch against your calves, a coarse linen shirt clings to your chest, and a cap hugs your head so tightly you hear the faint rustle of fabric with each movement. Your breath warms the inside of the cap, dampening it, but the alternative, naked skin against icy air, would be unthinkable. In immigrant households, certain traditions colored the choices of sleepwear. Scandinavian settlers often swaddled children in layers of sheepskin or fur, fastening them with strips of cloth like little winter cocoons. German families prized wool undergarments, knitted thick and long enough to cover the wrists and ankles. English settlers clung to their long shirts, garments that doubled as both daywear and nightwear, simple but functional. Each cultural habit bent toward the same purpose. Don't let the body's warmth slip away. One offbeat memory comes from a frontier child who recalled sleeping in mittens, knitted too large, which slid off in the night and were found stiff with frost by morning. The idea of mittens in bed may sound humorous now, but imagine waking to fingers so numb they barely moved. Mittens became not just comfort, but protection. Historians also puzzle over how families managed hygiene under such layers. Infrequent washing was the rule, not the exception. Wool retained odors, and linen nightshirts rarely saw soap during the long winter months. To us, the thought of sleeping for weeks in the same garments might sound unbearable. Yet to them, it was simple reality. Water froze, soap was precious, and survival mattered more than scent. Diaries sometimes joke about the companionable smell of the household at night, a humor sharpened by necessity. Imagine the sensory picture more fully. You stretch your feet within coarse stockings, the wool stiff where it has frozen slightly from earlier dampness. Your fingers fumble with the edge of a cap, tugging it down against your ears. The quilt lies heavy above, but the true shield is what clings closest to your skin. Every layer is another wall, not of logs or shutters, but of cloth standing against the wind outside. In some families, children wore so many layers that bedtime became an ordeal. One memoir remembers being packed like a sausage in wool and linen until movement was almost impossible. Parents laughed at their bundled children, but they also knew that each extra layer meant another chance to wake with rosy cheeks instead of blue lips. Researchers remain divided on the symbolic meaning of sleepwear too. Was it simply utilitarian, or did it carry a sense of modesty and dignity in shared sleeping arrangements? Some argue that nightclothes preserved privacy in households where everyone slept side by side. Others believe modesty was a luxury frontier families could not afford, their clothing choices driven purely by necessity. And then there were the improvisations. Old sacks turned into shirts, scraps of fur stitched into makeshift socks, even newspapers wrapped around legs for insulation. One farmer's wife recalled wrapping her children's feet in cabbage leaves before slipping them into stockings, claiming the layers kept frostbite at bay. Whether practical or desperate, such measures remind you how creativity became as vital as wool or feathers. As dawn approached, families stirred stiffly, peeling off night layers with reluctance. Shirts and stockings were stiff with sweat or frost, caps askew, hair flattened beneath them. The first step onto the icy floor made the body shiver, but the knowledge lingered. The clothes had done their job. They had carried you through another night. Now, as you rest in this imagined cabin, you feel the scratch of wool, the heaviness of layers, the odd comfort of a cap pulled low. It isn't glamorous, and it isn't meant to be. It is survival stitched into fabric, worn to bed, because warmth is worth more than beauty. Wrapped so tightly, you drift into sleep, grateful for every coarse thread guarding you against the darkness. The quilt presses heavy against you, your wool cap pulled low, but the fire still glows faintly in the hearth. And here, in the stillness of midnight, another kind of warmth joins the arsenal of survival warmth carried directly into bed. Frontier families discovered that stones, bricks, and even pieces of iron could become little suns if heated in the fire, wrapped carefully and tucked beneath quilts. These glowing bundles might seem simple, but on the coldest nights they meant the difference between restful slumber and hours of bone-deep shivering. Evidence from diaries and household notes makes it clear that the bed warmer was a beloved tool. Some households owned metal pans with long handles, designed to scoop coals and slide them across the mattress before sleep. Others relied on simpler methods, bricks heated in the coals, or flat river stones warmed all day by the fire. Once glowing with heat, these objects were wrapped in cloth, slipped under quilts, and left to radiate comfort through the night. The glow itself didn't last long, but for a few blessed hours it softened the icy air. One curious recollection from a settler's memoir mentions potatoes baked in the hearth, then tied in cloth and carried to bed. Children clutched them like dolls, warming small hands as they drifted off. By morning, the potatoes were cold and shriveled, but still edible, a practical blend of supper and survival. The detail might raise a smile now, but to those families it was a clever merging of food and heat in a world that offered little of either. Researchers are still divided over how widespread such practices were. Some argue that only households with surplus firewood or iron tools could afford to waste fuel on heating stones. Others suggest the custom was nearly universal, since even the poorest cabins had access to rocks and a hearth. What is certain is that stories of hot bricks and bed warmers appear across regions, suggesting a survival tactic as old as the cold itself. Let yourself imagine the sensory experience. A brick wrapped in cloth is slid beneath your quilt. At first, the heat is almost too much, making your feet recoil. But slowly it fades into a gentle warmth that spreads through the bedding. You sigh into the darkness, feeling the stone's energy seep into your bones, warding off the ache of cold toes. The smell of scorched cloth mingles faintly with wood smoke, sharp but oddly comforting. In a world of harsh deprivation, this small luxury feels almost extravagant. One unusual practice among Dutch immigrants involved filling earthenware jugs with hot water, corking them tightly, and slipping them under quilts. The jugs radiated warmth for hours and could be reheated easily each evening. Some families even carried them into sleighs or wagons, turning winter travel into a slightly less punishing ordeal. Imagine the clink of pottery against wooden bed frames, the steam rising as corks hissed loose in the morning. Debates among historians focus on the safety of these practices. Some argue that hot coals in pans posed enormous fire risks, especially in straw-filled cabins. Indeed, stories survive of bedding igniting, flames racing across quilts before being beaten out in panic. Others insist that the risks were manageable, pointing out that careful wrapping and experience kept accidents rare. Perhaps the reality lies in the middle families balanced the gamble of fire against the certainty of frost. Now picture the rituals of evening. A child crouches by the hearth, poking a stone deeper into glowing coals. A mother checks the cloth wrapping, frowning at a singed edge. The father lifts the warmed stone carefully, tongs in hand, before sliding it into the bed. The family exhales in unison when the heat spreads through the quilts. These moments carried more drama than modern households can easily imagine. The fire had to be coaxed just right, the heat captured at just the right time, the bedding adjusted to trap it all. In sensory memory, these bed warmers left powerful impressions. One pioneer recalled the smell of wool smouldering where a stone pressed too close, the fabric singed but the warmth irresistible. Another wrote that she could always tell when the stone cooled because her dreams shifted from soft to restless, and she awoke pulling quilts tighter. The stones became part of the rhythm of sleep itself. And yet, improvisation never ended. When stones weren't available, families turned to whatever they had. Iron tools, kettles filled with hot water, even small sacks of heated sand. Some native techniques, adopted by settlers, used heated earth buried in pits beneath bedding, though these were less common in cabins. The creativity reveals how determined families were to harness every flicker of warmth from their environment. Children often treasured these warm bundles like companions. Letters describe youngsters naming their heated stones, carrying them from hearth to bed like cherished toys. By morning, the stones lay cold and lifeless, but at night they seemed almost magical, glowing with the day's fire. You can almost hear a child's laughter as they clutch a wrapped brick, whispering goodnight before drifting into sleep. Modern echoes of this survival trick remain in the hot water bottles and electric blankets of today. But in the frontier cabin, these warmed objects weren't conveniences, they were lifelines. A single brick could mean fewer tears, fewer chills, and one more family making it through another punishing winter night. Now, as you stretch beneath the imagined quilt, feel the warmth at your feet from a stone pulled fresh from the hearth. Let it sink into your body, easing the sting of cold that nips at your nose and ears. Outside, snow heaps higher against the walls, and the wind prowls like a hungry animal. Inside, the stone radiates its borrowed heat, small but steady, carrying you just far enough toward dawn. The brick still glows warmly in your imagination, hidden under quilts like a secret ember. Yet the truth is, no matter how many stones were tucked into beds or quilts stitched together, all of it would have failed without one essential foundation. Wood. Firewood was the currency of survival. Every ember in the hearth, every stone warmed for sleep, every pot of stew simmering late into the night depended on an unbroken supply of cut and stacked logs. Without them, the frontier family faced the cold with empty hands. Accounts from the 18th and 19th centuries consistently emphasize how much time communities devoted to fuel gathering. Families didn't just chop a few logs now and then. They spent entire seasons cutting, splitting, and hauling. It is clear from farm records that a single household might require 10 to 15 cords of wood to last through a harsh winter, each cord a towering stack measuring 4 feet high, 4 feet deep, and 8 feet long. Imagine that mountain of labor, every piece carved by human muscle. One offbeat detail comes from a Vermont diary describing would-be's gatherings where neighbors worked together to cut and split logs for families who had fallen behind. These communal events were half necessity, half celebration. Axes rang through the forest as men worked side by side, while women prepared hot cider and food, children darting about to gather chips for kindling. By dusk, a yard that once looked bare now brimmed with stacked cords, and laughter echoed alongside the aching of muscles. Experts continue to disagree about whether wood shortages were common on the frontier. Some regions, thick with forests, offered what seemed like endless supply. Others, especially prairie settlements, left families desperate, hauling logs from far away or burning twisted roots and dried buffalo dung instead. Letters from Kansas and Nebraska speak bitterly of prairie winters without trees, while diaries from Maine describe wood so plentiful that cabins burned it extravagantly. Survival strategies shifted as dramatically as the landscape itself. Step into the scene with your senses. The sound of axes biting into frozen trunks echoes across a white valley. You smell the sharp resin of pine, the earthy sweetness of oak. Splinters prick your palms, and your breath clouds the air as you heave another log onto the growing stack. Your body aches, but you know that each stroke of the axe is also a stroke of insurance against the coming night. One curious practice among Appalachian families was the building of wood collars around tree stumps, stacking split logs in circular piles to season more evenly, protected from snow. Children sometimes climbed these stacks, playing games, while adults measured the piles with careful eyes. A shortfall in wood wasn't just inconvenient, it was a death sentence waiting in January's dark. Debates among scholars persist about how much of this labor fell on children. Some argue that boys as young as 6 or 7 were expected to help with kindling, while teenagers hauled logs nearly as large as themselves. Others suggest families spared younger children, assigning them lighter chores. The conflicting accounts reveal the blurred line between work and survival, where every hand, no matter how small, carried its share of the burden. Picture the rhythm of daily life. At dusk, after farm chores and meals, families often went back outside, axes swinging by lantern light. The cold bit at fingers, but the sound of chopping became its own music, steady and reassuring. Inside, the fire popped as fresh logs were stacked by the hearth, the smell of resin mixing with smoke. Everyone knew that tomorrow the cycle would begin again. Curiously, some communities developed rituals around the cutting itself. In Scandinavian immigrant families, the first log of winter was sometimes split with a prayer for protection. In New England, neighbors joked that the neatness of a woodpile revealed a man's character. Crooked stacks suggested laziness. Straight rows suggested diligence. Even children learned to read these signals, associating order with safety. Imagine the weight of responsibility pressing down on the father who glanced at his dwindling woodpile in February, snow still falling hard outside. Anxiety gnawed as he measured each stick burned. Letters describe men trudging miles through snow to borrow wood, returning with sleds groaning under the load. The relief of seeing logs stacked high again was palpable, a visible wall of defense against the icy wilderness. Sensory memory lingers strongest in the evening, when fires burned bright from the day's cutting. Families clustered around the hearth, cheeks flushed from heat, feet thawing after chores. Children poked at embers, women sewed by flickering light, men sharpened axes for tomorrow. Outside, the wind keened, but inside the crackle of burning wood became a lullaby, a rhythm of survival. The debates about efficiency still ripple among researchers. Was it better to burn green wood, which smoked but lasted longer, or dried logs, which flared hot but quickly? Some argued for hickory's strength, others for pine's easy catch. Each household built its own philosophy, refined by trial, error, and sometimes tragedy. Smoke-blackened ceilings and coughs told part of the story. Warm beds and glowing embers told the rest. There's a poignant image in one settler's recollection, a boy falling asleep to the sound of his father splitting logs outside, the thud of axe against wood marking time as steadily as a clock. That rhythm, he wrote later, was the sound of life itself, keeping us safe through the night. To him, every log was more than fuel. It was reassurance that his family would see another dawn. So now, as you lie under quilts in this imagined cabin, you can almost hear the echo of axes outside, the whisper of logs stacked high, the sigh of fire devouring wood. Each ember in the hearth carries with it the memory of hours of labor, of sweat in the cold, of hands blistered and healed. And with every crackle, you know you are safe for one more night, shielded by the forests cut down and the community that rose up with every swing of the axe. The woodpile stands tall outside your mind's cabin now, a fortress of stacked logs glowing faintly in the lantern light. But when the family finally retreats indoors, when the shutters are sealed and the fire begins to dim, the night demands something more subtle: light. Not the bright glare of modern bulbs, but the wavering, fragile glow of candles, lanterns, and sparks. Light guided midnight steps across cold floors, comforted children who feared the dark, and offered just enough vision to stir the embers without burning the whole cabin down. It is well established in household records and trade ledgers that candles were among the most precious domestic goods on the frontier. Tallow, beeswax, or even grease pressed into molds provided short-lived flames that sputtered and smoked. Families guarded them jealously, trimming wicks with small scissors and saving every drip of wax to be melted and reformed. Fire gave warmth, but light gave safety without it. One stumble in the dark could scatter embers across straw, risking disaster. One peculiar but memorable account from a Pennsylvania settler describes the use of pine knots, resin-rich chunks of wood that flared brightly when set alight. Families used them instead of candles, propping them in iron holders to light a room. The downside was the thick smoke and shower of sparks, which stained ceilings black. Yet to the children of that household, those knots seemed magical torches that turned the cabin into a flickering cave of shadows and gold. Scholars remain divided on whether families relied more on candles or oil lamps during the harshest winters. Some argue that rendered tallow from livestock made candles the most accessible choice. Others highlight trade records showing whale oil and kerosene arriving even in remote towns, suggesting that lamps played a larger role. Perhaps the truth is that families used whatever they could obtain, improvising from week to week. Now step closer into this dim space with your senses. The room is dark except for the flame of a single candle, its light flickering across the walls, throwing shadows that shift like restless spirits. The air smells faintly of smoke and fat, a mixture that clings to hair and cloth. When you move across the room, Your own shadow looms large on the wall, stretching monstrously, then shrinking with each step. Every creak of the floorboard feels amplified in the fragile circle of light. One curious custom in some immigrant households was to assign a child the task of light keeper. Their duty was to carry the candle holder during late-night trips across the cabin, whether to the hearth, to fetch water, or to check on younger siblings. Imagine the pride of a 7-year-old clutching a lantern, eyes wide as the room bloomed with shifting light. That flicker wasn't just illumination, it was responsibility handed down early. Researchers puzzle over the balance between safety and necessity. Too little light, and a child might stumble into the fire. Too much, and the family risked burning through their limited supply of tallow before winter ended. The flickering balance shaped the rhythm of frontier nights, brief bursts of glow, followed by long stretches of darkness where families huddled under quilts, speaking softly until sleep overcame them. Picture a midnight moment. The father rises to tend the fire. He slides from beneath quilts, the cold hitting him like a slap. A lantern swings in his hand, its glass smudged with soot, flame guttering as he crosses the cabin. The sound of his steps creaks through the silence, and the faint light wakes a child, who watches him like a ghost moving through shadows. He kneels by the hearth, pokes at embers until they flare, then returns to bed, leaving the room once again to darkness. One unusual tidbit appears in letters from frontier women. Some used glowing coals themselves as light, scooping them onto iron plates to brighten a room. The glow was enough to thread a needle or mend a tear, though it filled the cabin with a smoky tang. To modern eyes it seems risky. To them it was simply another tool pressed into service. Debates still swirl among historians about whether frontier families feared the dark more than their urban counterparts. Some suggest that isolation magnified fear, with wolves howling outside and only thin shutters for protection. Others counter that frontier children grew accustomed to near-total darkness, finding it no more alarming than daylight. What seems certain is that darkness shaped their routines. Bedtime came early, work ceased once candles were gone, and long hours stretched out for sleep. Imagine the sensory tapestry of such a night. The only light in the room comes from faint embers and a candle flickering low. You can hear the wax dripping, smell the fat burning, your eyes strain to make out shapes. But soon the darkness claims the corners, pressing them into invisibility. You curl closer under quilts, aware that your world is now limited to the circle of warmth and the faint glow of fire. Everything beyond feels vast, cold, unknowable. And yet, light carried comfort as much as it carried sight. A child drifting to sleep beneath the glow of a lantern felt safer, convinced that the flame itself kept danger at bay. Parents whispered stories by firelight, their faces half illuminated, voices low and soothing. The flame became not just a tool but a companion, a flickering friend that kept the wilderness outside at bay. Curiously, some communities embraced rituals of extinguishing. Families sometimes gathered for evening prayers by candlelight, then blew out the flame together, marking the official surrender to night. Children remembered the whoosh of breath, the sudden plunge into blackness, and the way silence grew thicker afterward. That ritual gave structure to their nights, a small ceremony turning danger into routine. Now, as you rest within this imagined cabin, feel the flicker of the candle at your bedside. Watch shadows ripple across the wall. Listen to the faint hiss of tallow burning. You know the flame will soon die, leaving you in darkness. But for these last moments, it cradles you in its fragile glow, reminding you that even the smallest light can carry you through the coldest night. The candle sputters lower in its holder, shadows creeping back into every corner of the cabin. You can almost hear the hush as the room prepares for the longest stretch of night. But while families hoped for uninterrupted sleep, the reality was far more fragmented. Someone always had to rise, shake off the weight of quilts, and coax the fire back from its fading embers. Sleep on the frontier often came in shifts, broken by the unending need to guard the hearth. Records from farm diaries and household notes make plain that tending the fire was an appointed duty. One person, sometimes the father, sometimes the eldest child, was tasked with rising in the dark hours to stir coals, add logs, and make sure the flames never died completely. It wasn't optional. A hearth gone cold meant waking to frost inside the cabin, frozen water buckets, and danger pressing in from every side. Fire had to be fed like a living creature, and families organized their sleep around its hunger. A curious recollection survives from a settler in Ohio, who wrote that his mother used a brass pot lid to cover embers at night, believing it smothered flames just enough to let them glow until morning. She still rose once or twice, lifting the lid to poke the coals. Her children joked she was like a nurse checking on a patient, fussing over her sleeping fire to keep it alive. That small detail captures the tenderness with which families regarded their only source of heat. Experts continue to debate how deliberate these sleep shifts were. Some argue that households consciously divided the night into watches, ensuring someone was always half awake. Others believe the pattern was more accidental. Parents stirred when cold seeped in, children woke from coughs or dreams, and tending the fire became the natural outcome of restless nights. Either way, frontier sleep was rarely the deep, unbroken slumber we imagine today. Step closer into the sensory rhythm of such a night. You are half dreaming when a chill brushes your face. Slowly, you push free of quilts, breath puffing white in the air. The cabin is nearly silent, save for the faint tick of cooling wood. You shuffle across the floor, bare feet recoiling from the icy earth, guided only by the red glow of embers. Kneeling, you prod them with an iron poker, sparks leaping like startled fireflies. A log slides into place with a sigh, and warmth begins to bloom again. The sound of your family's breathing grows deeper as heat spreads. You return to bed, sinking back into drowsiness, satisfied you've stolen a few more hours from the cold. One unusual practice among some families involved banking coals under ashes, with such skill that the fire could smolder for days without tending. Children learned this trick as early as they learned to walk, the lesson drilled in as vital. But skill sometimes faltered. Diaries mention mornings when the ashes were cold, and parents cursed softly while striking flint and steel, showering sparks until one caught on char cloth. On the worst days, no spark would catch, and a child was sent running through the snow to borrow live embers from a neighbor. You can picture it, a small figure clutching a pan of glowing coals, steam rising from breath, praying not to trip. Scholars still puzzle over whether these fire duties fell more heavily on women or men. Some accounts emphasize mothers who rose in the night, tending hearths while infants stirred. Others describe fathers or elder sons shouldering the task, sparing exhausted mothers from crawling from quilts. The lack of clarity reveals how every household adapted differently. What mattered wasn't who woke, it was that someone did. Now consider the psychological weight of broken sleep. Imagine lying in bed, never fully relaxed, always half aware of the fire's life. Dreams blur with duty, until the sound of wood collapsing in the hearth jerks you awake. Your body aches from fatigue, but your mind insists, the flames must not die. In this way, the cold reshaped even the rhythms of human rest, bending it into patterns of vigilance. One quirky anecdote tells of families turning this necessity into a game for children. Fire tending became a badge of pride, and siblings competed for the chance to rise and prove themselves responsible. Of course, once the novelty wore off, the chore was less glamorous, but the stories lingered. Adults later laughed that their first taste of adulthood came not from farm work, but from the moment they were trusted to keep embers alive at midnight. Disputes among modern researchers highlight whether such broken nights harmed health. Some argue that interrupted sleep weakened immune systems and left families more vulnerable to illness. Others point out that segmented sleep was common across cultures before modern lighting, with people naturally waking for short watches in the middle of the night. Perhaps frontier life wasn't so unusual after all, it simply pushed humanity's natural rhythms to their limits. The sensory details return as you lean closer to the fire. Ashes hiss, logs crack, smoke curls lazily upward. Your fingers sting from frost, but soon they thaw in the glow. You hear a cough from the quilts, the rustle of someone turning, then silence again. The room feels timeless, suspended between wakefulness and sleep. This is the world of the midnight watch, half shadow, half dream, entirely ruled by flame. Imagine how morning must have felt after such nights. Parents groggy, children yawning, everyone's movements slow from fractured rest. Yet the pride of keeping the fire alive carried them through. To wake with glowing coals in the hearth was to wake victorious, having wrestled warmth back from the grip of darkness. So tonight, as you nestle once more beneath heavy quilts, remember that your sleep would not have been whole. You would have shared it with duty, rising and resting in turns, guarding the fragile flame that stood between your family and the deadly cold. And in that watchfulness, you would have found not only survival, but a quiet rhythm of resilience, proof that even in broken slumber, life endured. The fire has been coaxed back to life, its glow spreading across the packed earth floor. Quilts rustle as everyone shifts back into slumber, yet in this half-dark, half-warm hush, the children whisper. For them, winter nights weren't only battles against cold, they were stages for imagination. When the wind howled and the shutters rattled, stories, songs, and games filled the void. These little rituals gave comfort, distracting young minds from the icy draught creeping across their cheeks. Contemporary diaries often note how lullabies softened the night. Mothers sang in low voices, tunes carried across generations, ballads from Scotland, hymns from New England, or improvised verses about the chores of the day. The rhythm of song, paired with the rocking of a cradle or the gentle pat of a quilt, steadied small hearts. Songs weren't only music, they were tools, part of the arsenal against fear and cold. One unusual recollection preserved in a pioneer family's memoir tells of children playing shadow animals on the wall by candlelight. Their fingers became dogs, birds, or monsters, flickering against rough logs. The game, silly and short-lived, made the draft-ridden cabin feel like a theatre. For a few minutes the cold retreated behind giggles and shrieks. Historians remain divided about how common such diversions were. Some argue that long nights were dominated by silence, broken only by coughs and snores. Others insist that play was essential, that children always carved space for laughter, even in hardship. The truth may lie between moments of quiet punctuated by bursts of chatter, games, or whispered jokes under quilts. Step into the sensory world of one such night. You are lying close to your siblings, quilts pulled to your nose, while your mother hums. Her voice is soft, roughened by smoke and fatigue, yet the melody fills the cabin with warmth beyond fire. You smell tallow from a guttering candle, hear the creak of the rafters above. The song fades, and now your brother begins a rhyme, his voice mischievous. Soon you're laughing too, the sound muffled under quilts, until your father clears his throat half stern, half amused, and everyone settles back into drowsy silence. A curious detail emerges in letters from German immigrants. Children sometimes chanted counting rhymes in both German and English before sleep, a way of practicing language and easing fear. Imagine the jumble of syllables, half understood, but repeated until voices trailed off into snores. In this way, even language itself became a lullaby, stitching old worlds to new. Researchers debate whether such practices carried deeper meaning. Were these lullabies and games mere distractions, or did they function as lessons, embedding moral tales or cultural identity in the quietest hours? Some argue that songs about bravery, faith, or hard work were designed to strengthen children's spirits for the hardships ahead. Others suggest they were simply improvised comforts, born of tired parents, desperate to hush restless children. The uncertainty lingers, like the echo of a song long after its final note. Now imagine the physical sensations. A child fidgets under quilts, legs kicking straw beneath. Cold toes poke against a sibling's back, provoking muffled protests. Someone sneezes, the sound loud in the stillness. Yet laughter follows, and for a brief moment, the cabin feels less like a prison of cold and more like a shared stage of life. The sound of play, even faint, carried as much warmth as the embers in the hearth. One eccentric practice described in a Kentucky homestead was a game called breath clouds. Children exhaled into the cold air above quilts, giggling as their white puffs swirled like tiny ghosts. Parents scolded gently, "Save your heat," but the game returned night after night. The imagery is vivid, a dark cabin alive with drifting clouds of breath, children entranced by their own bodies producing something visible, magical. Scholars also note that winter storytelling often carried warnings. Tales of travelers frozen in snowdrifts or of spirits that prowled outside reminded children to respect the cold. These stories, half frightening, half comforting, taught lessons through fear. Yet in the dim glow of fire, those warnings softened into rituals of bonding. A child listening to a parent's hushed voice felt secure, even when the tale spoke of danger. Think of the sensory arc of such storytelling. The fire pops, a dog sighs at the foot of the bed, and your father begins a tale in his low, deliberate voice. Shadows stretch across the wall as he speaks. You clutch your quilt tighter, both afraid and thrilled, until drowsiness overtakes fear. By the time the story ends, your eyelids droop, and the winter night has lost some of its bite. Researchers remain intrigued by the way these practices turned hardship into memory. Adults writing decades later often described childhood winters with surprising fondness. They remembered not the cold, but the laughter, the songs, the stories whispered in dark corners. This nostalgia hints at how play and song reframed suffering, transforming survival into something children could recall with warmth. One quirky anecdote describes a mother knitting by firelight, while her children performed songs they had learned at school, stumbling over lyrics but laughing at their own mistakes. The cabin became a stage, the quilts their costumes, the hearth their spotlight. For a little while, the howling wind outside turned into applause. As you sink deeper into this vision, imagine yourself in that bed once more. The cold still nips at your face, drafts still creep under the door, but around you laughter fades into snores, songs dissolve into silence, and stories linger like ghosts in the rafters. The games and rhymes don't erase the cold, but they wrap the night in warmth of another kind, carrying children, and parents too, into a gentler sleep. The laughter of children fades, leaving the cabin quiet again. Outside, the wind moans, and snow piles higher against the log walls. Yet even as families fought drafts and shivered under quilts, they sometimes discovered a strange ally in the very substance that seemed most hostile: snow itself. Where most see snow as an enemy, smothering fields and freezing rivers, frontier families often used it as an insulator, a natural barrier against the bitter cold. Written accounts from New England to the Great Plains mention settlers banking snow against the outer walls of cabins. The logic was simple. Snow, though icy to the touch, trapped pockets of air, creating a protective layer much like a quilt around the home. It reduced the sting of wind, muted outside noises, and even helped keep the fire's warmth from leaking away. Imagine the sight of a cabin half buried in drifts, windows peeking out like sleepy eyes under a thick blanket of white. One unusual observation from a Canadian settler's letter describes deliberately shoveling snow against the house until it reached the eaves. "We live in a cave of snow," he wrote, "but never were the warmer for it. Inside, the fire burned brighter, and the temperature held steadier than in autumn's bare-walled chill." To modern ears, it sounds paradoxical, piling frost to fight frost, but in practice it worked. Experts remain divided over how common or intentional this practice was. Some argue it was a calculated technique learned from indigenous neighbors who built snow shelters for warmth. Others insist it was simply a byproduct of winter storms, with families taking advantage of drifts that piled naturally. The lack of agreement reveals how survival blurred the line between design and adaptation. Did families engineer their snowbanks? Or did they merely accept nature's gift? Perhaps both were true, depending on the household. Step into the sensory world of such a cabin. The walls are muffled, the outside sounds softened until even the howl of wolves becomes distant. Light filtering through oiled paper windows turns bluish, tinted by the snow pressed against them. Inside, the air feels stiller, less drafty, though smoke from the hearth lingers longer, trapped by the new insulation. The scent of burning wood mixes with the faint dampness of melting snow at the wall edges, a fragrance both earthy and sharp. One curious technique remembered in northern diaries involved cutting blocks of packed snow to build crude windbreaks around doorways. These makeshift walls funneled storms away from cabin entrances, preventing doors from freezing shut. Children often helped in this labor, dragging small sleds piled with icy bricks, their mittens stiff with frost. The result was a doorway guarded by gleaming white walls, more fortress than farmstead. Researchers still debate whether snow insulation posed risks as well as benefits. Some accounts describe leaks when snow began to melt early, soaking bedding or collapsing walls. Others suggest that banking snow too high increased fire hazards, trapping sparks and smoke. The practice walked a narrow line between blessing and curse, much like every frontier survival tactic. Imagine the physical effort of maintaining these defenses. Each morning, after storms, families trudged out with shovels or even bare boards to pile snow higher. Breath steamed in the frigid air, arms ached from heaving heavy drifts, but the work continued until walls gleamed white. Children turned the labor into play, sculpting tunnels or carving initials, while parents nodded approval at the solid barrier forming. A particularly quirky recollection comes from a Minnesota homestead, where children carved windows into the snowbanks themselves, peering out through glowing blue ice. They called it their winter castle, pretending they were kings and queens defending against invisible armies. To them, the snow was less enemy than playground, transforming hardship into wonder. Scholarly debate also touches on whether indigenous practices directly inspired settlers' use of snow as insulation. Native peoples across North America had long known how to shape snow into protective structures, igloos in the Arctic, snow lodges in northern forests. Some historians argue settlers borrowed openly from these traditions, while others believe they stumbled onto the same discoveries independently. Either way, the snowy frontier became not only an obstacle but a resource. Picture the cabin on such a night. Outside, snow presses close against the walls, and the room is hushed as though underwater. The fire flickers, painting the snow in faint orange glows through cracks. Your family sleeps more soundly, less disturbed by drafts. The world feels smaller, closer, but safer, like being tucked inside the Earth's own quilt. One settler later wrote nostalgically about winters buried in white silence. He recalled that the muffled world gave a sense of peace, even as storms raged beyond. The snow, for all its dangers, became a strange companion, a guardian pressing close while wolves howled farther away. It is a reminder that even the harshest element could, with cleverness, be turned into an ally. So as you curl deeper into your imagined bed, hear the hush of snow piled high against the cabin, feel the drafts vanish, and sense the paradox, that frost itself has wrapped you in warmth. Outside, the night howls. Inside, silence reigns, and you drift toward sleep in a cocoon shaped by winter's own hand. The cabin now rests in its snowy cocoon, muffled and hushed. Yet much of what settlers knew or thought they knew about surviving these nights wasn't invented on their own. They watched, listened, and borrowed. The first people who truly mastered winter in North America were indigenous nations, who had centuries of practice shaping furs, shelters, and fire into strategies of endurance. Frontier families, though often reluctant to admit it in their letters and journals, quietly leaned on that knowledge to make it through the coldest nights. Historical accounts from New England, the Great Lakes, and the plains often hint at these exchanges. Native households used wigwams, tipis, or earth lodges, designed to trap heat efficiently, each form tested by generations. Settlers, by contrast, arrived with log-building traditions unsuited to bitter North American winters. When they realized their cabins leaked heat, they observed their neighbors and adapted. They learned to bank fires in pits for longer heat, to drape furs thickly around beds, and to insulate shelters with natural materials. Though official documents rarely credited this borrowing, oral histories preserve the memory of native guidance offered and sometimes ignored. One unusual anecdote tells of settlers in the Great Lakes region copying the Ojibwe custom of sleeping beneath layers of animal hides with fur turned inward. Unlike woven quilts, furs clung closer, their natural oils repelling moisture. Children remembered the smell of bear or deer hides, pungent but protective, spread across beds until the whole family seemed wrapped in the forest itself. That sensory detail, musky fur mingling with wood smoke, marked survival in ways cloth alone could not. Researchers remain divided about how deeply these indigenous practices penetrated settler life. Some argue they became widespread, shaping everything from fire pits to clothing. Others suggest they were adopted only in dire emergencies, dismissed when settlers could fall back on European traditions. The debate highlights how cultural pride and prejudice often obscured the practical reality. Survival cared little for origins. If it kept you alive, you used it. Imagine the sensory world of a wigwam adapted for winter. Birch bark walls sealed with spruce gum, mats of cattail reeds layered inside, furs piled thick across the floor. A small fire pit smolders in the center, smoke drifting upward through a vent at the top. The air is warmer, steadier, without the drafts of log cabins. Settlers stepping into such spaces described astonishment. How could bark and hides outmatch their heavy cabins? Yet they did, precisely because indigenous people had shaped their designs for this land's particular cold. One curious practice borrowed quietly by some frontier families was the use of raised sleeping platforms. Instead of bedding directly on the icy ground, hides were spread over wooden frames or reed mats, lifting bodies away from cold earth. Letters mention children sleeping more soundly when lifted just a few feet higher. The difference was profound. Less heat lost, fewer shivers, longer rest. Experts disagree about whether settlers acknowledged the debt of these lessons. In many journals, you find vague phrases, "We discovered a new trick," or "We tried a different method," with no mention of the native teachers who demonstrated them. Yet parallel details across regions suggest the borrowing was more than coincidence. A fir curtain here, a snow-banked wall there. The slow migration of knowledge threaded through necessity. Now picture yourself wrapped in one of these borrowed techniques. A fur pelt lies heavy over your quilt, its coarse guard hairs brushing against your chin. Beneath, warmth clings tightly, different from the scratch of wool, denser, more primal. The fire pit in the cabin's center glows steadily, heat rising without flickering away through a chimney. The air smells of resin, fur, and earth, a blend at once strange and soothing. Outside, snow presses hard, but inside, borrowed wisdom shields you. One quirky memory recounted by a settler child recalls their father stuffing cattail fluff into cracks between logs, marveling at how the downy fibers resisted drafts. The trick, he admitted, came from a native neighbor. To the children, it felt like sleeping inside a giant pillow, the walls padded and muffled. Such moments of ingenuity, sometimes dismissed, sometimes cherished, blended traditions into new forms of survival. The scholarly debate still circles. Did settlers truly embrace indigenous winter knowledge, or did they simply pick fragments, reshaping them into European molds? Some argue the persistence of log cabins proves cultural stubbornness. Others counter that the very survival of frontier families in regions like Minnesota or Ontario shows they must have adopted more than they admitted. Either way, these nights tell a story not only of endurance, but of quiet cultural exchange. Think of the children who grew up in those blended households. They heard lullabies from European roots, but slept under furs laid in patterns borrowed from native practice. They whispered stories about wolves outside while breathing air softened by cattail insulation. Their memories carried both worlds, stitched into the same quilt of survival. And so, as you settle back into your imagined bed, the fur heavy on your chest, the fire pit glowing softly in the center of the room, you feel how survival transcends pride. The night cares little for heritage. It demands warmth, and families found it wherever wisdom showed the way. Indigenous knowledge became part of their quiet armor, shaping nights that would otherwise have ended in silence. The warmth of borrowed furs lingers in your imagination, but not all nights ended with comfort. Even with quilts, snowbanks, and careful fire tending, families often woke to a more terrifying reality: numb fingers, stiff toes, and the creeping dread of frostbite. The cold was not just a nuisance, it was a predator, gnawing at the edges of sleep, ready to steal sensation, and sometimes lives before dawn. Medical records and early doctors' journals make it plain that frostbite haunted frontier winters. Settlers wrote of waking to find water buckets frozen solid, hair stiff with ice, and children's hands swollen and white. Unlike the sudden shock of a snowstorm, frostbite crept in silently during the night. Sleepers might not notice until morning, when toes refused to wiggle, or a child cried at the sting of thawing fingers. One haunting but peculiar story survives from a diary in upstate New York. A father discovered his son's ears frozen stiff after a night in the loft. The boy had slept closest to the drafty wall, and while the rest of his body was shielded, his ears lay exposed. The family rubbed snow against them, a treatment thought helpful at the time, and prayed they would recover. They did, though scarred, a lifelong reminder of one winter's cruelty. Experts still disagree about how frequently frostbite claimed victims. Some historians argue that fatalities were relatively rare, since families had so many layered defenses. Others believe the silence of records masks the true toll, with cases downplayed in letters out of shame or grief. The truth may lie somewhere in between. Serious frostbite wasn't nightly, but the fear of it lingered in every household. Now, step into the sensory world of such fear. You lie beneath quilts, but cold creeps in like an intruder, brushing over your feet. At first it feels like a prickling numbness, then a deeper ache, until even shifting your legs does little to help. You tuck your feet tighter against a sibling's calves, desperate for warmth. Your nose stings, your ears burn with cold, and you bury your face deeper into the blankets. Sleep comes fitfully, chased by dread that you'll wake without sensation in your hands or toes. One unusual but memorable treatment settlers believed in was rubbing affected skin with goose grease or bear fat, hoping the oils would restore circulation. Some even wrapped frozen fingers in onion poultices, convinced the pungent vapors drew warmth back. To us, these remedies sound eccentric, but they represent the constant improvisation born of desperation. Scholars continue to debate whether frostbite prevention shaped sleeping arrangements more than comfort did. Some argue that placing children in the center of the family bed had less to do with affection and more with keeping their extremities alive. Others maintain that closeness was a cultural tradition, with frostbite avoidance an added benefit. Either way, the result was the same. Children slept shielded by layers of parents and siblings, their tiny hands tucked into the crooks of arms for protection. Imagine the morning routine after a particularly harsh night. Parents rise to check each child, rubbing their fingers, pressing toes, blowing warm breath against ears. Sometimes children cry from the sharp pain of thawing, but the sound is oddly reassuring. It means blood is flowing again. On quieter mornings, when children only whimper or stay silent, parents' fear deepens, knowing frostbite might already have taken hold. A curious tidbit emerges in accounts from Scandinavian immigrants. They sometimes carried embers in small metal tins under beds to keep frost at bay. The tins radiated warmth, but also risked sparks. For these families, the gamble was worth it. because nothing frightened them more than waking to frozen skin. One Swedish settler bluntly wrote, "Better smoke than no fingers." Researchers remain divided on how much frostbite actually altered community life. Some believe severe cases were rare enough to be treated as cautionary tales rather than common occurrences. Others argue that scars, missing digits, and frostbitten ears were quietly common, shaping the very look of frontier communities. Perhaps the silence of records speaks less to rarity and more to resignation. It was simply part of life. The sensory impact is haunting. Imagine touching your own hand and finding it stiff, waxy, almost foreign. The sting of thawing feels like needles driving into the flesh, leaving you gasping. Children screamed, adults gritted their teeth, and neighbors whispered prayers. Frostbite wasn't just physical, it left psychological scars, reminding families of the fragility of every night. Quaint, almost comical memories sometimes softened the terror. One child recalled being told to wiggle your toes all night long, or Jack Frost will bite them off. He obeyed, turning the fear into a kind of game, fighting sleep with restless feet. Yet beneath the humor lay real urgency, because many families knew of neighbors who hadn't been so lucky. And so, frostbite joined the nightly ritual as both fear and teacher. It taught families to huddle closer, to double-check shutters, to pile snow against walls, to guard embers like treasure. It reminded them that winter was not a season to endure passively, but an adversary to battle hour by hour. Now, as you drift back into the imagined bed, pull the quilt tighter around your face, tuck your hands beneath your chest, and press your toes into the warmth of another body. Outside, the night still rages. Inside, you sleep lightly, haunted by the knowledge that the cold can steal more than comfort. It can steal pieces of you. And so you cling to every ember, every quilt, every shared breath, willing yourself to wake whole at dawn. The sting of frostbite still lingers in your imagination, but the cold carried other dangers that didn't leave visible scars. Even if toes and fingers survived the night, the lungs and chest often did not. Families on the frontier faced an endless list of winter illnesses, coughs that rattled for weeks, fevers that rose in overheated cabins, and the strange restlessness later known as cabin fever. Survival wasn't only about warmth of the body, but also resilience of the spirit. Medical notes from early physicians and midwives describe how respiratory sickness peaked during long winters. Without proper ventilation, cabins filled with smoke from damp wood, animal odors, and condensation dripping from ceilings. Children wheezed, their coughs echoing through the night, while adults felt their lungs burn with each breath. Pneumonia, bronchitis, and influenza claimed lives in numbers that frightened even hardened pioneers. One doctor from Vermont wrote bluntly, "The cold spares the body less than the fire spares the lungs." An unusual recollection from a frontier mother mentions her children waking with their hair frozen to the cabin wall where breath condensed and turned to ice. She pulled them free gently, but the cough that followed lasted all season. These tiny details reveal how easily cold and dampness translated into illness, gnawing at health even when frostbite was avoided. Researchers remain divided about how much these illnesses shaped mortality. Some argue that winter sicknesses killed more settlers than starvation or wolves combined. Others insist that while illness was common, most families endured, weakened but not destroyed. The disagreement underscores the fragile balance. Sometimes coughs faded with spring, but other times they lingered, hollowing families of parents or children alike. Step into the sensory world of such nights. You're wrapped in quilts, but the air is thick with smoke, your throat scratchy from breathing it in. A sibling coughs beside you, the sound harsh and hollow, while your mother murmurs comfort. The fire hisses as damp logs smolder, sending up a bitter odor. Your chest feels heavy, each breath shallow, and though you try to drift into dreams, the rasp in your throat anchors you to wakefulness. One quirky remedy remembered in family letters involved hanging sliced onions around the cabin, believed to absorb illness from the air. Children laughed at the pungent smell, teasing that their home smelled more like supper than a sick room. Another common trick was drinking hot toddies, water, whiskey, honey, and herbs administered even to children, the warmth spreading through their bodies like liquid fire. Whether these cures worked or not, they gave families a sense of control against unseen threats. Scholars debate whether cabin fever described a real condition or simply the psychological strain of confinement. Letters speak of restlessness, quarrels, even sudden fits of weeping during endless storms. Was it illness of the mind, born of isolation, or just boredom sharpened by hardship? Historians still puzzle over the phrase, but the feelings it described are easy to imagine. Trapped by snow, staring at the same four walls, nerves fraying until even the crack of the fire seemed too loud. Imagine the morning after such a night. Parents rise with red eyes, their voices hoarse from coughing. Children whine with fever, refusing to leave quilts. The water bucket is a solid block of ice, and fetching more means trudging outside through snowdrifts. The family forces down broth, hoping heat will chase away chills. Yet beneath the fatigue, determination stirs. They have survived another night, and they will survive another still. One odd yet striking practice was to place iron pots of boiling water in the cabin to create steam, believing it eased lungs. The result was condensation dripping down log walls, sometimes freezing into glittering patterns. Children traced them with fingers, calling them ice paintings, while parents shook their heads at the dampness soaking bedding. Even in attempts to cure, the cold found ways to sneak back in. Experts also argue about the long-term impact of these winters on children's health. Some suggest repeated illness stunted growth, while others note that frontier children grew surprisingly hardy, their bodies toughened by constant exposure. Perhaps both are true. Some were broken by winters, others forged stronger by them. The uncertainty only deepens the sense of how precarious each night's rest could be. Now immerse yourself fully. Hear the chorus of coughs in a crowded bed. Smell the onions hanging from rafters. Feel the clammy dampness of quilts that never quite dried. A candle sputters, throwing light across worried faces, while parents whisper prayers over sick children. Sleep, when it comes, is shallow and uneasy, haunted by the rasp of breath and the fear that morning may bring silence instead of recovery. One poignant recollection from a settler's memoir tells of siblings huddled together, whispering stories to distract a sick brother. They described summer fields, warm sunshine, and green leaves until his breathing softened and he drifted into slumber. In that moment, imagination became medicine, easing suffering as surely as any herb. So, as you settle into your imagined bed again, let yourself feel the heaviness of lungs, the dampness in the air, and the fragility of every breath. Illness stalks these nights as surely as frost, reminding families that survival wasn't just about keeping warm, it was about holding on through coughs, fevers, and restless minds. Yet through songs, remedies, and stubborn love, they clung together, each night another victory over winter's quiet siege. The sound of coughing lingers in the dim room, but before anyone can truly rest, another duty calls. On the frontier, sleep was never simply a matter of closing your eyes. Before the quilts could be pulled high and the fire left to smolder, animals had to be tended one last time. Barn chores, done at night, weren't optional, they were survival itself. Without warm livestock, there would be no milk, no meat, no draft animals to haul wood through snow. So families braced themselves against the cold, stepping out into the dark to care for creatures whose needs were as pressing as their own. It is well documented in farm journals that evening chores were a ritual of the frontier. Men and boys hauled hay, broke ice in water troughs, and checked stalls for drafts. Women carried scraps to pigs, milked cows in steaming corners, and tucked chickens into coops. Only after these tasks were done could families retreat indoors for the night. Sleep was earned through work, and every animal fed meant one less worry gnawing in the back of a parent's mind. One unusual recollection comes from a Wisconsin settler who described pouring buckets of hot stones into the barn to raise the temperature. Wrapped in burlap, the stones glowed faintly in corners, giving livestock just enough warmth to endure. He admitted the smell was strange steaming hay mixed with scorched cloth, but he swore the animals huddled closer and survived nights that might have killed them otherwise. Scholars remain divided on how often such late-night barn visits occurred. Some argue that chores were limited to daylight hours, with families unwilling to brave storms after dark. Others point to countless diaries describing lanterns swaying through snowdrifts at midnight, proof that care never paused just because the sun had set. Perhaps it depended on the severity of the winter. Mild nights allowed longer rest, while harsher ones demanded constant vigilance. Now imagine yourself stepping outside into such a night. You push the heavy door open, and wind roars in, stealing your breath. Snowflakes sting your cheeks like tiny needles. The lantern in your hand flickers wildly, casting gold rings across the white expanse. Each step crunches loudly, echoing in the silence, while your body trembles under layers of wool. Yet you trudge onward, because animals wait, and their survival is tied to your own. Inside the barn, the air is warmer, heavy with the smell of hay, manure, and the living breath of cows and horses. You hear the low rumble of a cow shifting, the impatient snort of a horse pawing at straw. Your hands, stiff with cold, reach to scatter feed, to rub a muzzle, to whisper reassurance. The lantern light throws long shadows across beams, and for a moment, the barn feels like a cathedral sacred, not with prayer, but with the ritual of care. A curious practice remembered in Appalachian families was bedding animals down with layers of pine boughs. The needles gave off a sharp, clean scent, masking odors and adding insulation. Children often helped gather the branches, dragging them through snow, their mittens full of sap. Settlers joked that the animals slept in finer beds than their owners, but no one doubted the necessity. Debates still swirl among historians about whether tending animals at night robbed families of too much rest. Some argue that exhaustion compounded with sickness and cold, leaving adults vulnerable. Others counter that the rhythm itself, chores before bed, again at dawn, became second nature, woven so deeply into daily life that it no longer felt like a burden. What seems clear is that fatigue was constant, but so was resolve. Picture the sensory details of finishing such chores. Your boots squelch in half-frozen muck, the lantern sputters as a gust sneaks in through a crack, and the cow's hide feels rough beneath your numb fingers. You smell the sweet hay mingling with the acrid bite of smoke from your lantern. The warmth of the barn is relative chill, still nips at your ears, but compared to the howling storm outside, it feels like a reprieve. One quirky memory comes from a child's diary. She loved to sneak sugar cubes to the family horse during winter chores, watching its warm breath puff white in the lantern light. She admitted the treat was rare, but the horse nickered softly afterward, and in her words, it was like being blessed before bed. Such small rituals reveal how chores became not only survival tasks, but moments of quiet intimacy between humans and their animals. Experts argue about how much barns truly protected livestock in deep winter. Some claim that poorly built structures were little more than windbreaks, offering scant relief. Others emphasize that even minimal shelter made the difference between life and death. Families often judged their success not only by their children's survival, but by how many animals still stood when spring thaw arrived. Now return with me to the imagined cabin. You finished scattering hay, checked water buckets, whispered your goodnights to the animals. You step back into the storm, lantern low, the path faint in the swirling snow. Your cheeks burn, your hands ache, but you know the creatures in the barn breathe easier because of you. Inside, quilts wait, fire glows, and children already drift towards sleep. One settler later wrote that the quietest comfort came after chores, when he slipped back into bed, body thawing slowly under quilts. I knew, he wrote, that beasts and babes alike were safe, and then I could rest. That sense of completion, chores done, animals cared for, family warm, was its own kind of lullaby. So as you settle once more beneath quilts in your imagination, Feel the ache of muscles earned in the barn, the sting of wind still fading from your skin. Sleep comes not easily but deservedly, softened by the knowledge that everything depending on you has survived the night thus far. And in that earned rest, you find warmth deeper than fire itself. The lantern is set aside, the barn door latched, and the family drifts back beneath quilts. Yet in the silence of night, when embers glow faintly and frost pushes against shutters, another layer of protection is summoned, one that came not from wood or stone, but from faith and superstition. Frontier nights were haunted not only by the cold, but by fears of what might slip in unseen. To guard themselves, families turned to prayers, charms, and whispered rituals, blending Christian devotion with folk practices carried from Europe or learned along the way. It is widely recognized in letters and oral histories that evening prayers were as much a part of frontier routine as chopping wood. Before sleep, families gathered near the fire, children's heads bowed, parents' voices steady despite the howl of the storm outside. They prayed for warmth, for health, for survival until dawn. For many, these prayers were not only spiritual habits, but psychological shields against despair, helping them face nights that might otherwise feel endless. One curious recollection from a Pennsylvania homestead tells of a mother placing a Bible beneath her pillow each winter night, convinced it kept away both sickness and frost. Her children joked about the lump under her head, but they later admitted that the act calmed them too. Even if the cabin still shook in the wind, they believed the sacred book built an invisible wall against harm. Experts continue to disagree about how widespread these protective customs were. Some scholars argue that frontier families clung fiercely to prayer because isolation stripped them of other comforts. Others contend that superstition played an equal role, with charms and sayings woven into nightly routines regardless of formal religion. The disagreement itself reveals how survival blurred the boundaries between faith, folklore, and practicality. Step into the sensory space of such rituals. The fire crackles low, casting long shadows across the walls. A father's voice intones a psalm, steady and slow, while children fidget under quilts, their eyes catching the glow. A mother murmurs blessings over each child's head, her hands rough but gentle. Outside, the wind wails like a chorus, yet inside, the words wrap the family like an unseen quilt. You feel the shift in the air, less fear, more calm as prayers settle into silence. One unusual practice remembered in immigrant households involved hanging small bags of herbs above beds. Sage, juniper, or even garlic cloves were believed to repel illness and spirits alike. Diaries mention the sharp smell filling cabins, mingling with smoke and sweat. Children teased each other about sleeping with the garlic ghosts, but they also admitted the scent became part of winter's rhythm. Scholars debate whether these rituals held practical value or merely comforted anxious minds. Did garlic and herbs truly ease lungs in smoky cabins, or did belief itself provide relief? Did whispered blessings ward off disease, or did they simply reassure children enough to sleep? Modern researchers still puzzle over the line between medicine and magic in frontier life. Perhaps it mattered less whether charms worked than whether families believed they did. Now imagine a child clutching a small wooden cross, its surface smooth from years of fingers rubbing it before bed. Beside him, his sister whispers a rhyme taught by their grandmother, "Cold winds pass, warm hearts stay." The rhyme is nonsense, perhaps, but its cadence soothes. The cabin grows quieter, breaths slow, and even though drafts still slip through walls, the children believe they are guarded. That belief is warmth in itself. One quirky anecdote comes from a settler's letter describing how his wife sprinkled salt across the cabin threshold before storms. She insisted it kept spirits and sickness from entering. The family laughed, but no one dared question her when nights were harsh. "Better to waste salt," he wrote, "than tempt fate." The gesture became habit, folded seamlessly into nightly chores. Debates among historians also touch on how these practices connected families to their pasts. Immigrants from Germany carried tales of night spirits that froze sleepers. Irish families muttered charms against the Black Breath. On the frontier, these old fears fused with new realities, shaping rituals unique to the American wilderness. Scholars argue whether these beliefs faded quickly or lingered, but children's memories suggest they persisted at least through a generation. Consider the sensory weight of such a night. The smell of burning sage drifts through the cabin. Salt crunches faintly underfoot near the door. A candle burns low beside a Bible, wax pooling across its cover. You hear your mother's whispered blessing. Feel her hand press briefly to your forehead. The wind groans outside, but inside you are surrounded by layers both visible and invisible: quilts, furs, fire, faith. One poignant recollection tells of a father leading his children in prayer, while a neighbor's cabin burned in the distance. The family huddled in terror, yet the father's words steadied them: "The Lord is our shield." The child who recorded the memory decades later admitted he was never sure whether faith saved them, but he knew it gave them courage to endure. So, as you drift once more beneath quilts in your imagined cabin, breathe in the mingled scents of herbs, smoke, and sweat. Feel the lingering press of a blessing on your brow. Hear the low murmur of prayers weaving through the dark. Whether superstition or devotion, these rituals hold the night at bay, giving you one more layer of protection as the storm rages beyond the walls. And in that fragile shield of faith and charm, you find rest. The prayers fade into silence. The herbs sway faintly in the rafters, and for a time all is still. Yet even when the body found some warmth and the spirit some calm, the mind often refused to surrender easily. Frontier families wrestled with a subtler challenge during those long nights: sheer exhaustion tangled with anxiety. Sleep was not guaranteed. Sometimes it was broken into fragments. Sometimes it never came at all. Rest, like firewood or quilts, was another scarce resource, rationed unevenly by circumstance and nerves. It is well attested in journals that families rarely slept in one uninterrupted block. They rose to tend fires, soothe coughing children, or check on animals. Some households even spoke of first sleep and second sleep, a pattern where people slumbered for a few hours, woke for a while, then drifted off again until dawn. This segmented rhythm echoes practices seen across pre-industrial Europe, suggesting it was not simply frontier necessity but also a human tradition rediscovered under harsh conditions. One unusual memory comes from a woman in upstate New York who recalled her father pacing the cabin between sleeps, whispering psalms to himself. He claimed the quiet hours calmed his heart, though his children teased that he walked like a restless bear. For her, the memory of those heavy footsteps became part of the soundscape of winter, as familiar as the crack of wood or the sigh of quilts. Scholars remain divided about whether segmented sleep was beneficial or harmful. Some argue it provided natural breaks to tend chores and fires without feeling robbed of rest. Others insist it left families perpetually fatigued, weakening immune systems and tempers alike. The absence of consensus reflects the ambiguity of memory. What one settler remembered as a peaceful routine, another described as torment. Now imagine yourself caught in such a rhythm. You drift into drowsiness as the fire hums low, only to jolt awake when a log collapses with a sharp crack. For a moment you lie still, heart racing, until you realize the sound is harmless. You rise anyway, stirring embers, checking on siblings, listening to the wind. An hour passes in a half-dream, your mind wandering through prayers and worries, before you finally sink back into quilts for another stretch of uneasy sleep. One curious detail that surfaces in immigrant accounts is the habit of using these midnight hours for quiet crafts. Women might mend torn mittens or patch quilts by the faint glow of embers, their needles flashing briefly in the dark. Men sometimes sharpened tools or carved small objects from wood. Children, if awake, whispered games or traced frost patterns on the window. These acts turned sleeplessness into productivity, softening frustration with a sense of purpose. Debates continue among modern researchers about whether frontier people experienced what we would now call insomnia, Some letters speak bluntly of nights wasted in tossing, others of minds that could not still. Yet in a world where rest was always fragile, sleeplessness was less a condition than an accepted part of life. The question may be less whether they slept poorly, and more how they endured despite it. Picture the sensory texture of these restless hours. The cabin is hushed, but your ears strain to every creak. The quilt weighs heavily, yet offers no true comfort. Your mind replays the day's chores, wonders about dwindling firewood, frets over a child's cough. You hear the faint scratching of mice in the walls, the groan of the wind like a warning. In the half-light, shadows on the rafters seem to shift, teasing your weary eyes. Sleep slips away, replaced by a gnawing fatigue that grows heavier even as the night stretches longer. One quirky anecdote tells of a child who invented stories about sleep thieves, imaginary creatures who crept through cracks to steal rest from the cabin. His siblings believed him so fiercely that when they woke groggy, they blamed the thieves rather than the cold. Odd as it sounds, the tale eased their frustration, turning sleeplessness into a battle of imagination instead of despair. Scholars debate whether such fragmented nights shaped family bonds. Some argue that shared wakefulness, with parents and children whispering together in the dark, created intimacy that modern households rarely experience. Others suggest it frayed tempers, with exhaustion breeding quarrels. Both outcomes likely coexisted, as variable as the weather itself, some nights sweet with murmured conversation, others bitter with snapped words. Imagine the dawn that follows a restless night. Eyes are red, movements sluggish, voices hoarse. Parents stumble through chores, children complain of aches. Yet life presses forward. Wood must be chopped, animals fed, fires tended. Rest is a luxury deferred until spring. The memory of fatigue becomes part of the season itself, another hardship folded into survival. One poignant recollection comes from a woman who admitted she remembered no specific winter mornings of rest, only a haze of weariness. Yet she also remembered the laughter that sometimes bubbled up during midnight hours, the way her father's whispered stories made the shadows less frightening. Fatigue and comfort were braided together, inseparable strands of frontier memory. So as you lie once more beneath the quilt of this imagined cabin, feel the weight of exhaustion pressing against your eyelids, yet also the stubborn alertness that refuses to fade. The night may not grant you the luxury of full rest, but it grants you moments, snatches of sleep, murmured prayers, whispered games that carry you through until morning. On the frontier, survival often meant accepting less than perfect slumber and finding strength in the fragments that remained. The weight of fatigue presses against your eyelids, yet you know another disturbance lies ahead. On the frontier, even the smallest noises, those barely noticed in daylight, became magnified at night, when families tried to rest in fragile warmth. Sleep was a battle not only against cold and coughing, but against the sounds and creatures that prowled in darkness. Mice scratching in corners, wolves howling beyond the walls, even the groan of settling logs, all these became nightly companions, sometimes amusing, sometimes terrifying. Contemporary journals speak often of vermin. Mice scuttled through straw mattresses, rats nibbled at stored food, and in winter these creatures seemed bolder, slipping close to sleeping bodies in search of crumbs. Children recalled waking to tiny feet darting across quilts, a sensation both ticklish and unnerving. Cats, when allowed indoors, became guardians of sleep as much as warmth, chasing shadows in the rafters while families whispered thanks to their prowling. One curious account from a homestead in Maine describes a mouse falling directly onto a sleeping child's face from a loft beam. The boy shrieked, waking the household, and the father grumbled as he reset traps by firelight. "Our night's rest," the mother wrote, "was as gnawed as our bread." Such details capture the constant intrusion of small lives into the fragile cocoon of human rest. Experts remain divided about how much wildlife outside truly threatened families. Some argue that wolves, though often heard, rarely approached cabins. Others point to tales of doors rattled, livestock attacked, and men keeping muskets within arm's reach. Coyotes, owls, and even bears became part of the winter soundscape. The truth may lie in the middle. Real dangers were rare, but fear magnified every sound in the silence of night. Now picture yourself lying awake beneath quilts, ears straining. The wind groans low, almost like a voice. A branch scrapes against the roof, scratching as if fingernails drag across the logs. Somewhere outside, a wolf howls long, mournful, rising into the sky. A child buries their head against a sibling's shoulder, convinced the creature is just beyond the shutter. Even though you know the walls hold, your heart beats faster, every sound sharpening the darkness. One unusual detail noted in Scandinavian immigrant letters was the belief that certain bird calls at night foretold misfortune. Owls hooting near cabins were thought to signal sickness or death. Families sometimes clapped or threw embers at shutters to scare them away. Imagine the surreal scene. A tired father stepping into the night to wave a burning stick at an unseen bird, hoping to hush its omen. Laden cry so his children could sleep. Scholars debate whether these fears were born of superstition or of genuine survival instincts. Did families exaggerate animal threats to teach children caution, or were wolves and bears truly bold in winters of scarce food? The evidence is mixed, but the effect is undeniable. Nights were filled with tension, each creak of wood and howl of wind, a reminder of how thin the barrier between human and wilderness truly was. Inside, sounds multiplied too. Rafters popped as frost tightened, and families sometimes mistook the noise for intruders. One settler remembered his father leaping from bed with a musket, only to laugh sheepishly when the noise proved to be a log shifting in the fire. Yet the fear lingered, and children carried those memories for decades, retelling them with both dread and humor. The sensory palette of such nights is rich. Imagine the crackle of fire, the rustle of straw beneath your mattress, the faint gnaw of mice in the pantry. Over all of it, the breath of your family rises and falls like a tide. Then comes the sudden howl, the crash of snow sliding from the roof, the patter of tiny claws across the rafters. Each sound jolts you from drowsiness, and sleep returns only slowly, if at all. One quirky anecdote tells of a family who named the noises in their cabin to make them less frightening. The popping rafters were old bones, the scratching mice were little shoes, and the howl outside was the singing dog. Children laughed at these names, and when they woke to the noises, they whispered them instead of crying. By transforming fear into play, the family softened the edge of nightly disturbances. Debates among modern historians question whether such noise-filled nights shaped frontier resilience. Some suggest the constant interruptions trained families to live with vigilance, attuned to every sound. Others argue it simply eroded rest, leaving bodies weaker and tempers shorter. Either way, sound became a constant thread woven through the tapestry of winter survival. Imagine dawn after such a night. Parents wake groggy, rubbing eyes, while children recount the noises they heard real or imagined. Bread is cut with laughter about little shoes or sighs about wolves. The cabin brightens slowly with daylight, shadows retreat, and the sounds that ruled the night fade into ordinary morning chores. Yet the memory of them lingers, shaping stories told long after. So tonight, as you drift back into this imagined bed, listen carefully. Hear the pop of rafters, the whisper of mice, the distant cry of wolves. Know that each sound belongs to the wilderness, pressing close, testing the fragile shelter of your home. And in the midst of fear and noise, you discover that sleep, when it finally comes, is not the absence of sound but the ability to rest in spite of it. The noises of wolves and mice still echo in your imagination, but sometimes the frontier night was broken not by nature's voice, but by the sound of other people. Cabins were small, and privacy was nearly impossible. Whole families and sometimes visiting relatives or neighbors caught in storms slept within arm's reach of one another. In that cramped intimacy, rest was never entirely your own. Every snore, every shift of a straw mattress, every whispered word carried through the space, weaving human presence into the fabric of the night. Letters and memoirs emphasize how common it was for multiple generations to share a single room. Grandparents slept in corners nearest the fire, parents and infants in the center bed, older children tucked into lofts, and guests wherever space remained. Some households counted a dozen bodies crammed into one cabin. Warmth was gained, but individuality dissolved. A night's sleep was a shared experience, a symphony of breathing, coughing, and murmuring voices. One unusual but telling account comes from a traveler in Kentucky who described bedding down with a frontier family during a snowstorm. He noted that he could identify each member of the household by their nighttime sounds: the father's deep snores, the mother's soft prayers, the grandmother's wheezy cough, and the children's occasional giggles before drifting off. For him, it was strange. For the family, it was routine. Scholars continue to debate whether this lack of privacy bred harmony or tension. Some argue it strengthened family bonds, teaching patience and closeness. Others insist it frayed nerves, as exhaustion magnified irritations. The truth likely varied night to night. Laughter one evening, quarrels the next. The records capture both, revealing households as noisy, living organisms, never silent even in sleep. Step into the sensory reality of such a night. You lie wedged between siblings, their elbows poking your ribs, their feet cold against yours. The straw beneath rustles every time someone shifts. Above, in the loft, a cousin snores loudly, the sound rattling like a saw through wood. Your grandmother mutters in her dreams, half words drifting through the dark. The air is thick with warmth and the mingled scents of sweat, wool, and smoke. Privacy is a fantasy, but warmth is real, and so you surrender to the crowded cocoon. One curious custom in some households was to designate the snoring corner. Whoever snored the loudest was banished to a pallet farthest from the main bed, though still in the same room. Children joked about drawing straws to decide who would endure that corner's racket. This practice, humorous as it sounds, reveals how families tried to impose order on chaos. Historians disagree about whether settlers viewed these cramped arrangements with embarrassment. Some letters describe them matter-of-factly, while others downplay the details. Perhaps modesty discouraged open discussion. Yet the very absence of silence in records hints that everyone knew and accepted the reality. Frontier families slept not as individuals, but as a collective body. Picture the dawn after such a night. A dozen sleepers stir at once, quilts tossed back, voices overlapping. Someone sneezes, another coughs, a child cries for breakfast. The room fills instantly with noise and movement, erasing any memory of silence. Privacy remains a dream, but the bonds of shared survival linger. One quirky anecdote comes from a pioneer child who confessed to deliberately kicking her brother awake just to hear him groan, "It's too cold to fight." The mischief softened the monotony of winter nights, turning irritation into play. These small acts of sibling rivalry wove humor into hardship. Researchers also puzzle over how gender roles shaped sleeping spaces. Did men and women separate by necessity, or did survival erase those lines? Some argue that families adhered to modesty even in tight quarters, using curtains or careful arrangements. Others claim that in deep winter, modesty gave way to urgency. Warmth mattered more than custom. Evidence remains mixed, but the question underscores how survival reshaped even cultural norms. Now imagine yourself drifting off amid this symphony. Snores rumble, coughs punctuate, whispers float across the room. You shift, uncomfortable yet oddly comforted, knowing every sound is proof of life. The closeness feels suffocating at times, but it also means no one is alone. Each breath reinforces that survival is not solitary, it is shared. One poignant recollection from a settler's memoir captures this truth. She wrote, "Though we quarreled, though we groaned, I loved the sound of my family breathing beside me. Silence meant death, and so I was glad for the noise." Her words remind us that irritation and gratitude often coexisted in equal measure. So as you sink once more beneath quilts in your imagined cabin, let the chorus of snores, coughs, and murmured dreams fill your ears. It is not peace in the modern sense, but it is reassurance. You are part of a living whole, tangled in warmth and noise, carried together through the long winter night. The snoring fades into the rhythm of breathing, the cabin thick with warmth and noise. But rest was never just about comfort. It was also about vigilance. For frontier families, danger wasn't only in drafts or frostbite, it was in the fear that fire might leap from the hearth, or that raiders, thieves, or desperate travelers might arrive at the door. Sleep carried with it a fragile tension. How deeply could you rest when you knew the world outside, and sometimes even the world within, could shift without warning? It is widely documented in journals that firearms often lay close to the hearth or bedside. Muskets leaned against walls, powder horns within reach, as much a part of the bedroom as quilts and pillows. Families accustomed to isolation knew that an unlatched door or an inattentive night could end in loss of animals, supplies, or even lives. Even in the stillness of winter, when snow buried trails, unease never fully vanished. One unusual recollection comes from a settler in Illinois, who described waking to the sound of scratching at the door. His father leapt from bed, musket in hand, heart pounding. The intruder turned out to be a neighbor's half-starved dog, yet the memory stayed vivid, the feeling of being hunted, even in the supposed safety of sleep. "We dreamed with one ear open," he later wrote, "and with powder close at hand." Scholars continue to debate how much actual violence intruded into nightly life. Some argue that raids and theft were exaggerated fears, fueled by stories and memory. Others insist they were real enough, citing letters of stolen livestock and burned barns. The truth likely varied region to region. Some cabins faced little more than restless animals, while others stood in contested land where every sound outside carried genuine menace. Now place yourself in such a night. You lie beneath quilts, the fire dim, when a creak echoes from the shutter. Your eyes fly open, heart racing. The sound could be a branch swaying, or it could be a stranger. You grip the quilt tighter, listening, every breath in the cabin suddenly sharper. The musket leans close, its wooden stock gleaming faintly in firelight. You hope you never need it, but you draw comfort from its presence. Only when silence stretches long again do your eyelids drift closed, uneasy but resigned. One curious practice among some German immigrant households was the use of iron bars across doors, wedged firmly each night. Children remembered the loud scrape of bar against wood, a sound that meant safety. When the bar was set, one memoir notes, "I felt I could sleep." That small ritual, repeated daily, became part of the lullaby of frontier nights. Debates among researchers also touch on how communities shared the burden of vigilance. Did families feel truly alone, or did they rely on neighbors for reassurance? Some evidence suggests that households sometimes rotated night watches when threats loomed, particularly during conflicts. Others argue that isolation left each cabin to fend for itself, a solitary fortress in a vast, cold wilderness. Consider the sensory detail of vigilance. The smell of gunpowder hangs faintly in the air, a reminder of its constant readiness. A dog shifts by the door, growling low, then settling. The wind howls, rattling shutters like hands shaking a lock. Your mind flickers between drowsiness and alertness, between the comfort of warmth and the fear of intrusion. The body longs for rest, but the mind refuses complete surrender. One quirky anecdote tells of a family who trained their goose to honk at any sound near the cabin. "Better than a watchdog," the father joked, though he admitted the goose once woke them all by shrieking at a falling branch. Children giggled at the false alarms, but the goose was fed generously nonetheless. In its noisy way, it gave the family peace of mind. Experts remain divided on whether such constant vigilance harmed sleep more than it helped survival. Some argue it frayed nerves, leaving adults weary and children anxious. Others believe it heightened awareness and resilience, teaching families to balance rest with preparedness. Whatever the effect, it shaped the psychology of nights. Every dream carried a shadow of awareness. Every silence felt temporary. Now imagine dawn breaking after a night of vigilance. The father yawns but smiles, relieved that the musket remained untouched. The children tumble from quilts, laughing at their goose or dog's overzealous alarms. Breakfast tastes better because danger passed them by again. In these moments, relief itself became nourishment, strengthening families for another day's labor. One poignant recollection from a pioneer woman captures this balance. "We slept lightly, but we slept together," she wrote. "And if danger came, we knew we would rise side by side." Her words suggest that vigilance was not only about fear but about unity. Every creak of the shutter reminded families of their fragility, but also of their resolve. So as you lie once more beneath the quilts of this imagined cabin, feel the weight of safety and danger pressed together. The musket gleams faintly nearby, the shutters strain against the wind, and your ears remain half awake. Sleep will come, but never without its edge of tension. For on the frontier, to close your eyes fully was to trust in your family, your rituals, and your fragile shelter, all that stood between you and the dark. The musket rests near the door, the iron bar wedged tight, and at last the household slides back into uneasy slumber. Yet what defined many winter nights on the frontier wasn't just the chill of fear or the weight of quilts. It was the strange, persistent rhythm of dreams. When sleep finally claimed exhausted bodies, it often came thick and heavy, producing visions that families remembered vividly. In a world where waking life brimmed with hardship, dreams offered both escape and omen, coloring how people faced the next day. Accounts in letters and diaries frequently remark on the intensity of winter dreams. Perhaps it was the segmented sleep, perhaps the combination of smoky air and heavy meals, or simply the mind's attempt to soothe itself in darkness. Whatever the cause, frontier people spoke of dreams with unusual seriousness. They were not idle fancies but messages, sometimes divine, sometimes sinister, that shaped behavior long after dawn. One curious anecdote comes from a homesteader in Ohio who wrote that his wife dreamed of a field of green wheat in the dead of January. She woke convinced spring would come early, and the family planned their planting accordingly. Though spring proved late, the dream lingered as a kind of talisman, a story retold to neighbors with equal parts hope and amusement. Scholars remain divided about whether frontier people interpreted dreams primarily through religion or through folk tradition. Some argue that biblical imagery dominated, with visions seen as warnings or comforts from God. Others point to the persistence of old-world superstitions, dreams of water foretelling sickness, dreams of animals predicting weather. The truth likely wove both threads together, producing a tapestry of belief where sacred and superstitious coexisted without conflict. Step into the sensory fabric of such a dream-heavy night. You drift into slumber after hours of cold vigilance. The quilt is heavy, the fire dim, your body aching. Suddenly, you walk through a meadow in full bloom, sunlight warm against your face. You hear bees, smell fresh hay, feel grass beneath your bare feet. For a few blissful minutes, you escape the snow pressing against your cabin walls. Then you stir awake, nose numb, breath misting in the frigid air, and the shock of contrast makes the dream feel sharper, more precious. One unusual custom remembered in immigrant households was to share dreams aloud at breakfast. Families recited their visions between bites of porridge, interpreting omens and laughing at odd details. Children competed to tell the strangest tales, flying pigs, rivers of honey, while parents sought patterns in images of storms or fires. These morning rituals gave meaning to rest that was otherwise fragmented and shallow. Researchers debate whether dreams served a therapeutic role in these households. Some argue they provided relief, allowing people to process fear and longing in symbolic form. Others suggest they deepened anxiety, especially when interpreted as warnings. What cannot be denied is that dreams filled conversations, turning invisible nights into tangible stories. Imagine the sensory strangeness of waking from one of these visions. The warmth of a dream lingers in your body, but the cabin is cold, your breath sharp. You blink at shadows, half convinced the dream still surrounds you. A sibling stirs and mutters, pulling you back into reality. Yet all day, as you chop wood or fetch water, the dream hovers like a phantom, as real in memory as the frost beneath your boots. One quirky recollection from a Minnesota child tells of her father dreaming of wolves each night for a week. Convinced it was an omen, he built higher pens for the livestock. No wolves came, but the dream reshaped his labor nonetheless. In this way, the unconscious mind sometimes dictated the rhythms of daylight chores. Scholars still argue whether such vivid dreaming was heightened by diet and environment. Did heavy stews and scarce vegetables alter sleep chemistry? Did smoke-filled cabins and irregular sleep cycles intensify REM cycles? The science remains speculative, but the testimonies are consistent. Frontier dreams were memorable, sometimes frightening, often oddly beautiful. Consider the layered texture of a family recounting them in the morning. Children chatter excitedly, mimicking their dream animals. Parents exchange glances, half believing, half dismissing, yet still noting what was said. Grandparents mutter about old sayings. A fish in dreams means illness. A stranger means news. The conversation blends belief, skepticism, and humor, making dreams a communal property rather than a private secret. One poignant story survives from a widow who dreamed of her late husband on a bitter winter night. She described him standing at the hearth, smiling silently. The dream gave her such comfort that she awoke convinced he had visited to reassure her. "I slept warmer after," she wrote. In this, we glimpse how dreams softened grief, transforming loss into presence. So, as you return once more to your imagined bed, feel the heaviness of quilts pressing you down into sleep. Hear the faint sigh of embers, the breath of family around you. Then drift into visions, fields of summer, voices of loved ones, animals prowling just beyond reach. On the frontier, such dreams weren't just fleeting illusions. They were part of survival, a second world where the cold could not intrude, where even for a few hours, hope bloomed like spring in the heart of winter. The warmth of dreams lingers faintly, but dawn has not yet come. The cabin is still, the fire low, and the cold presses in again. In these hours between night and morning, food, both the memory of it and the reality of what remained in the pantry, became another element of survival. Sleep was easier when the stomach was full, but winter scarcity meant families often drifted into slumber on little more than broth or scraps. Hunger was another silent companion beneath the quilts, and it shaped how frontier households endured their nights. Farm journals and family letters frequently mention the strain of rationing. Cornmeal, dried beans, and salted pork were staples, yet by January, supplies ran thin. A family might eat just enough to keep moving during the day, then settle into bed with hunger gnawing at their bellies. Some parents confessed to sending children to sleep early, hoping slumber would muffle their complaints. Others described stretching small meals into illusions of plenty, adding water to stew, breaking bread into thinner slices. The hearth gave warmth, but food gave strength, and when both were scarce, nights felt endless. One unusual but telling anecdote comes from a Missouri settler who recalled her mother slipping a hot potato into each child's hand before bed. The potato warmed their fingers, then doubled as a midnight snack if hunger stirred them awake. "We slept with supper in our palms," she wrote, "and dreamed of feasts while we nibbled." The memory captures both deprivation and ingenuity, a reminder that even small comforts could carry children through. Scholars remain divided about how severe frontier hunger truly was in winter. Some argue that households with foresight and strong harvests managed adequately. Others contend that shortages were widespread, with malnutrition common though rarely admitted in prideful letters. The lack of agreement reflects the unevenness of frontier life. One family thrived, another starved, often on neighboring farms. Now imagine the sensory reality of such a night. You lie under quilts, but your stomach growls, echoing louder in the silence. The smell of smoke teases you with memories of roasted meat, though none is left. Your mouth is dry, your limbs heavy. You press your potato closer, the warmth fading, the skin wrinkled. You nibble a corner, the taste bland but comforting, then tuck it back beneath the quilt. Hunger doesn't vanish, but it quiets enough for sleep to creep in. One curious practice among some Appalachian families was to drink hot water before bed, flavored with herbs if available. The warmth filled stomachs, tricking them into satisfaction, while the steam soothed throats. Children sometimes called it empty stew, laughing at the idea of pretending water was soup. Yet even pretense gave them comfort, proof that imagination could help where food failed. Researchers debate whether such strategies weakened bodies too much to endure winter labor. Some argue that meager diets left settlers prone to illness and exhaustion. Others suggest that frontier metabolisms adapted, bodies slowing to match the scarcity. Either way, the experience shaped memory. Children grew up recalling winters defined by not just cold, but the echo of hollow bellies. Picture the dawn that followed a night of hunger. Parents rise stiffly, eyes sunken, hands trembling slightly as they prepare thin porridge. Children sip slowly, savoring each bite as if it were feast enough. The day's chores loom large, but the body has little fuel. Sleep may have brought a temporary escape, but hunger greets them again with the morning light. One quirky anecdote tells of a boy who dreamed of pies each night, describing their flavors so vividly that his siblings swore they could taste them. His dreams became a nightly entertainment, his imagination filling the gap left by empty shelves. In this way, hunger inspired a kind of shared theater, where fantasy replaced fullness, if only for a while. Historians also debate whether scarcity built community resilience. Some argue that shared hunger bonded families, teaching patience and sacrifice. Others insist it bred resentment, as siblings quarreled over unequal portions. Letters hint at both parents praising children for generosity one night, scolding them for selfishness the next. Hunger tested not only bodies but relationships, shaping the atmosphere of each long winter night. Consider the sensory layer of memory here. The smell of dried beans simmering faintly, the taste of salt clinging to pork fat, the sight of shelves emptying as weeks dragged on. In the dark, these sensations became sharper, dreams of feasts contrasting cruelly with reality. To fall asleep hungry was to drift into a world of longing, where imagination became both torment and solace. One poignant recollection from a widow's diary captures the duality. "My children dreamed of bread," she wrote, "and I prayed their dreams would fill them." Her words reveal the mingling of hope and helplessness, the way food or its absence defined not only the stomach but the spirit of those winter nights. So, as you slip once more beneath the quilts of this imagined cabin, press the thought of food close. Perhaps it's a potato in your palm, perhaps only the steam of hot water in your belly. Hunger stirs, but sleep weaves its balm, offering visions of feasts and abundance. On the frontier, dreams of plenty were often the only abundance a family could count on, and even that was enough to carry them through until spring whispered of relief. The memory of hunger lingers in your belly as you drift beneath quilts, but another rhythm shapes the night just as surely the tolling of the seasons themselves. Winter was not one endless blur of cold. It shifted subtly week by week, with changes in snow, in light, in the way families prepared for sleep. Frontier households lived attuned to these rhythms, for each stage of winter demanded new adjustments in how to rest, how to preserve warmth, and how to survive. It is well established from farm records and letters that December nights, though harsh, often carried the energy of preparation. Families faced the first real storms with pantries still full, woodpiles stacked high, and spirits bolstered by recent harvests. Beds brimmed with fresh straw, quilts still thick with autumn repairs. Sleep, though cold, was softened by confidence. By January, however, provisions had begun to dwindle, and the novelty of snow gave way to weary routine. Quilts sagged, straw flattened, and firewood piles shrank ominously. By February, despair sometimes set in, with families dragging themselves through nights longer in spirit than in length. One unusual anecdote from a diary in Maine describes how children marked the passage of winter not by calendars but by their beds. In December, they slept atop straw that smelled sweet and golden. By January, the straw was dusty, itchy, and flattened, rustling little when they turned. By February, it was so broken down that they joked they were sleeping on flour instead of stalks. The changing texture of their mattress told them the season's progress better than any almanac. Scholars continue to debate how precisely families measured these shifts. Some argue that moon phases, star positions, and animal behavior gave constant clues. Others suggest that time blurred into a haze of cold, with only major events, storms, births, deaths standing out. The disagreement reveals how survival reshaped time itself. Calendars mattered less than the feel of straw, the weight of quilts, the echo of empty barrels. Now imagine yourself passing through these stages. In early winter, you lie on firm straw, quilts smelling of fresh dye, the pantry still echoing with jars and barrels. Hunger nags less, and you drift easily. By midwinter, the straw pricks, quilts are smoke-stained, and you pull them tighter, dreaming of fresh fabric. By late winter, the straw collapses beneath you, and quilts are patched with scraps. The fire burns low, food is meager, and sleep feels heavier, tinged with desperation. One curious practice remembered in Appalachian families was the February feast, a single night when families cooked something special despite scarcity. They believed it broke the back of winter's despair. Children looked forward to it as proof that spring would eventually come. The meal might be nothing more than cornbread baked with honey or a stew enriched with a little precious meat, but afterward, sleep came sweeter, as if the body finally loosened its grip on anxiety. Researchers argue about whether these seasonal adjustments hardened people or wore them down. Some suggest the cycle built resilience, training families to adapt constantly. Others insist it drained hope, leaving bodies and minds brittle by March. The evidence, as always, is mixed letters of despair one year, letters of gratitude the next. The sensory differences between these stages are vivid. In December, the cabin air smells of pine from fresh logs, quilts warm quickly, and children whisper cheerfully in bed. In January, the air turns thick with smoke, the quilts are heavy with soot, and laughter fades into grumbles. In February, silence grows everyone too tired, too hungry, too worn. Even the sound of the wind feels heavier, dragging against shutters like a burden rather than a song. One quirky anecdote tells of a boy who celebrated each February by carving a notch in his bedpost, counting down until thaw. His siblings teased him, but he claimed it helped him sleep, reminding him that each night endured was another step toward spring. His notched bedpost became a private calendar, a record not of dates but of survival. Scholars also discuss how these seasonal rhythms intersected with spiritual calendars. Christmas prayers, Epiphany hymns, or Lenten fasts gave shape to otherwise indistinguishable nights. Families often recalled songs sung at these times more vividly than the cold itself. The rituals layered human meaning onto the natural cycle, turning endless winter into a sequence of milestones. Imagine a February night, the hardest of all. The fire barely glows, the pantry is bare, and the straw beneath you has thinned to dust. You clutch quilts close, hearing only the sound of the wind. Yet you whisper to yourself or your children that spring will come. The knowledge doesn't warm your toes, but it warms your spirit just enough to coax you into uneasy sleep. One poignant memory from a settler woman captures this perfectly. She wrote, "In December we slept with hope, in January with patience, in February with endurance, and in March with relief. Her words map the emotional geography of frontier winter, a journey measured less in miles than in nights endured. So, as you close your eyes once more in this imagined cabin, feel the weight of those months pressing down. December's optimism, January's weariness, February's desperation, they all flow into the rhythm of sleep. The cold is constant, but the way you meet it shifts, shaping how dreams rise and how mornings are greeted. On the frontier, survival wasn't just about enduring the coldest night, it was about enduring the long procession of them, one after another, until spring finally cracked the world open again. The rhythms of December, January, and February have carried you this far, but the truth is that no two winters were the same. Each family crafted its own set of traditions, some practical, some emotional, that shaped how they endured their nights. These rituals weren't merely chores repeated in darkness. They were small acts of control, tokens of comfort, ways to transform a season of threat into a season of meaning. On the frontier, survival was never just physical. It was psychological, cultural, and even celebratory. Family journals often mention bedtime rituals that bordered on ceremony. Some households insisted on reading aloud by the fire, even if the text was just a scrap of newspaper or a battered Bible. Others ended each evening with a hymn, voices rising softly into rafters. The ritual mattered less for its content than for its predictability. It drew a line between day's labor and night's rest, marking the cabin as a place of safety despite the storm outside. One unusual recollection comes from a homestead in Ohio where children each placed a small stick on the fire before bed, symbolizing their contribution to keeping the family warm. The act was more symbolic than practical, but it gave children pride, teaching them that warmth was shared labor. "We each gave our spark," one child later wrote, "before we closed our eyes." Historians remain divided about whether such rituals were widespread or limited to particularly devout or imaginative families. Some argue that the constant grind of survival left little room for ceremony. Others insist that rituals were the very thing that made survival possible, offering order and morale. Perhaps the truth lies in variation. Some families stumbled into bed exhausted, while others found strength in ritual, however small. Now step into the sensory world of such traditions. The fire pops gently as each child places a stick into the flames. A hymn echoes softly, voices cracked but steady. A father's voice reads from a tattered book, the words drifting over quilts like a second blanket. You feel the air warm briefly as the fire flares, smell the resin of pine, hear the murmur of voices blending with the storm outside. It is no grand ceremony, but in its repetition, it becomes sacred. One curious custom among German immigrants was the telling of winter tales before bed, stories that combined folklore with family history. Parents recounted legends of spirits in the Black Forest, then folded in tales of grandparents braving ocean voyages. Children fell asleep believing themselves part of a long chain of survival, their own hardships linked to ancient ones. The cold became less isolating when framed as a shared inheritance. Scholars debate whether these traditions softened the memory of winters. Some argue that rituals gave families nostalgic lenses, making them remember the nights more fondly than they lived them. Others counter that the rituals were fragile shields, easily shattered by hunger or illness. Letters reveal both moods, sometimes warmth in memory, sometimes bitterness. The debates echo the reality of survival rituals could comfort, but they could not erase hardship. Picture the dawn that follows a night rich in ritual. Children wake with songs still humming in their ears, parents with prayers still echoing in their thoughts. Even if hunger gnaws or frost presses at the door, the memory of ceremony lingers, giving shape to the day ahead. Rituals transformed nights from mere endurance into moments of meaning. One quirky anecdote tells of a family who carved notches into their bedposts each night as a countdown to spring. Children argued over whose turn it was, laughing as they marked the wood. By March, the posts bore dozens of cuts, a visible record of endurance. To outsiders, it might have seemed childish vandalism, To them, it was a calendar carved in desperation and hope. Researchers also note that rituals weren't always solemn. Some families staged games of endurance before bed, who could stand barefoot on the cabin floor the longest, who could blow out the candle in one breath. Laughter punctuated these contests, distracting children from cold noses and empty bellies. In this way, ritual blurred into play, proving that resilience often hid itself in humor. Consider the sensory weight of these traditions. The flicker of firelight glints off children's eyes as they giggle at their carved notches. The sound of a hymn drifts upward, faint but resolute. The smell of singed wood fills the air as a stick is laid on the flames. Outside, snow presses harder against the cabin, but inside, warmth is woven not only from quilts and embers, but from voices, stories, and gestures. One poignant recollection from a woman who survived such winters as a child captures this spirit. We did not only endure the cold, we marked it, sang through it, carved it into memory. That is how we slept through nights that might have broken us. Her words suggest that survival was as much about meaning as about material. So, as you settle once more beneath the imagined quilts, feel the rhythm of these small traditions, the stick placed in the fire, the hymn hummed softly, the notch carved into wood. These are the rituals that turned a cold night into a remembered night, the fragile shields that carried families forward. And in their repetition, you too find comfort, knowing that meaning can be stitched into even the harshest hours of winter. The rituals linger in the air, the hymns, the bedtime stories, the stick laid on the fire, but now, as the long winter begins its slow surrender to spring, you sense the final truth about frontier nights. Survival wasn't measured by warmth alone, or by the fullness of bellies, or by the sturdiness of walls. It was measured by the simple fact that morning came, and the family was still together. Every dawn was a quiet triumph, proof that the night, with all its threats, had failed to break them. Letters and memoirs from the frontier, often close winter accounts, not with tales of grandeur, but with sighs of relief. We woke and saw the frost on the windows, and yet we lived. That line, repeated in one settler's diary, carries the essence of endurance. Winter nights were survived not because they were conquered, but because families clung stubbornly to each other, through quilts, through chores, through faith and fear. One unusual recollection comes from a Vermont family who celebrated the first night of thaw by sleeping with shutters wide open. Even though the air was still sharp, they wanted to breathe the promise of spring, to feel the cold without fearing it. The children laughed at the absurdity, shivering under quilts while moonlight spilled in, but they remembered it forever as the night when winter finally lost its teeth. Experts still discuss how these frontier strategies shaped the American character. Some argue that the resourcefulness sleeping on snow, inventing potato hand warmers, layering rituals bred resilience that echoed into later generations. Others caution against romanticizing, noting that many families suffered terribly and that survival often depended on luck as much as ingenuity. What is clear is that the experience of these nights, harsh, repetitive, filled with both fear and tenderness, became woven into the cultural memory of what it meant to endure. Now, step once more into the cabin. You lie beneath worn quilts, straw sagging beneath you, the smell of smoke thick in the air. A sibling breathes against your shoulder. A dog sighs at the hearth. The fire dwindles low. Outside, the wind still prowls, but inside, life holds. You feel the weight of hunger, the sting of drafts, the throb of fatigue, but you also feel the press of family, the warmth of shared rituals, the comfort of survival. Sleep takes you not as an enemy, but as a weary friend. One quirky tidbit survives from an old letter. A child confessed he sometimes wished winter nights would last longer, because only then could he stay tucked between his siblings, cocooned in closeness. It is a reminder that even in hardship, moments of sweetness lingered, reframing survival as not just endurance, but intimacy. Scholars continue to debate whether these experiences hardened or softened frontier families? Did the constant struggle make them more stoic, or did it teach them tenderness through shared dependence? The evidence bends both ways. Perhaps the truest answer is that it did both. It forged strength, but also carved empathy, reminding people that no one survived alone. So, when dawn finally breaks after the coldest night, the relief is palpable. Frost sparkles like glass on the window. The fire smoulders but has not gone out. Parents stretch stiff limbs, children blink awake, animals stir in the barn. The family has crossed another night, and in that crossing, they have kept the thread of life unbroken. Now let the story soften. Let the fire dim into a low glow, the wind ease into a whisper. Picture the cabin growing quiet, not from death or despair, but from rest. The night recedes, leaving only the memory of closeness, of survival, of warmth carved from scarcity. And now, as our long journey through the frontier nights draws to a close, I invite you to slow your breathing. Let the details of cabins and quilts, straw beds and snowdrifts fade gently from your mind. The struggle was real for those families, cold that bit to the bone, hunger that gnawed at the belly, noises that haunted every restless moment. Yet despite all that, there was survival, and in that survival, a kind of quiet triumph. Imagine the hush that follows a storm, when snow settles into soft silence. The cabin is still, the family asleep, and only the low crackle of fire remains. The air feels heavy but no longer menacing. In that silence, you too can find rest. Think of the warmth of shared quilts, the weight of straw beneath, the rhythm of breathing around you. These images belong not only to history, but also to you, now, as a comfort. The hardships are behind you. The night no longer threatens. You are safe, wrapped in memory and imagination, just as surely as frontier families were wrapped in wool and fur. Let your eyelids grow heavier. Let the wind outside soften into a distant hum. Let each breath carry you deeper, until the details blur, leaving only calm. The long winter has passed, and you have endured. Morning will come, as it always did for them, carrying light and warmth. For now, surrender to rest. Close your eyes, let the story dissolve into quiet, and allow yourself to drift gently into sleep. Sweet dreams.